Hello, everyone. I'm the narrator, and I'm here to guide you today. I know you use this video to unwind and relax, maybe even to fall asleep. Before we dive into the story, go ahead and like this video and subscribe to the channel. Also, let me know where you're from and what time it is as you're watching this. Now, find a comfortable spot, take a deep breath, and let's begin. The cameras were everywhere. Hidden in the kitchen clock, behind the bathroom mirror, even nestled within the plants scattered around the house. At first, I thought I was being paranoid. But now, I knew for sure, someone had been watching my every move for days. This was supposed to be an easy gig. My college roommate's parents needed someone to house sit while they vacationed in Europe for 2 weeks. The pay was excellent, the house was stunning, and I'd have plenty of time to work on my thesis. A win-win situation, right? Wrong. The first few days were calm and uneventful. I settled into a routine, waking up, brewing a cup of coffee, working on my laptop for a few hours, and maybe taking a dip in the backyard pool if the weather allowed. It was comfortable, almost too comfortable. But everything changed on the fourth night. That's when I started feeling off. As if invisible eyes were tracking my every step. I'd be reading on the couch and suddenly feel the urge to glance over my shoulder. Or I'd be in the shower, convinced I heard faint movements just beyond the curtain. At first, I brushed it off as nerves, natural when staying alone in an unfamiliar place. Then I found the first camera. It was pure chance. I was dusting the mantle. I take my house-sitting responsibilities seriously, when something odd caught my eye. A family photo, its frame unusually thick compared to the others. Curious, I picked it up for a closer look. That's when I saw it. A tiny lens, no larger than a pinhead, discreetly tucked into the corner of the frame. My blood ran cold. Suddenly, all those moments of unease made a horrifying kind of sense. My heart pounding, I began a thorough search of the house. In the next hour, I uncovered 6 more cameras. They were everywhere: the living room, the kitchen, my bedroom, even the bathroom. Someone had gone to great lengths to ensure every inch of this house was under constant surveillance. But why? And more importantly, who? I considered calling the police, but what would I even say? "Hi, I found some cameras in a house I'm house-sitting." For all I knew, the homeowners could have installed them for security purposes. Unlikely, given how well hidden they were, but not impossible. I needed more information before involving the authorities. I needed to figure out who was behind this. The next day, I acted as though nothing was wrong. I followed my usual routine, careful not to reveal that I had discovered the cameras. Meanwhile, I took inventory of every hidden device I'd found and searched for patterns. Most of the cameras seemed to be wireless, likely transmitting to a receiver nearby. If I could locate that receiver, I might be able to trace it back to whoever was watching me. That night, I put my plan into motion. I turned on every TV in the house, creating a wall of sound and static to mask my movements. Then, with a flashlight and my laptop, I began scanning for signals. I turned up the volume on the radios throughout the house, letting the sound fill every corner. Methodically, I began searching each room, hoping the noise would cover any sound I made and, with luck, mask my true intentions from anyone who might be watching. I started in the basement, inspecting every nook and cranny. Nothing. The first floor yielded the same results, and by the time I reached the second floor, I was starting to lose hope. That's when I noticed it, a faint detail that might have escaped an untrained eye. The attic access panel in the hallway ceiling was slightly ajar, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. Bingo! My heart raced as I pulled down the foldable ladder as quietly as possible, each creak of the old wood sending a jolt of adrenaline through me. What would I find up there? More importantly, would someone, or something, be waiting? Slowly I ascended, every sense on high alert. The attic was dark, damp, and filled with the usual assortment of forgotten boxes and old furniture. But in the far corner, something caught my attention, a faint blue glow. I moved cautiously toward it, my footsteps muffled by the dusty wooden boards. There it was, a laptop connected to a series of small monitors. Each screen displayed a different room in the house. My stomach churned as I saw myself on one of them, standing in the attic, bathed in the eerie glow of the electronic light. I had found it, the surveillance hub. Now, I needed to figure out who was behind this. The laptop was, of course, password protected. I wasn't a hacker, but I knew enough to check the browser history. Most of it had been wiped clean, but a few entries remained. As I read them, a cold chill ran down my spine. Searches for my name, my social media profiles, university records. Whoever was behind this wasn't just watching the house, they were watching me. Suddenly, a loud bang came from outside. My heart jumped into my throat. I ran to the attic window and peered out. A shadowy figure was approaching the house. I had to get out. Now. Racing down the attic ladder, I no longer cared about the noise I made. My only thought was escape. I bolted to my bedroom, grabbing my phone and wallet before heading for the stairs. That's when I heard it, the front door creaking open. I froze, one foot hovering above the last step. Heavy, deliberate footsteps echoed through the house. They knew I was there. Panic set in. The back door was locked. I'd never make it in time. The windows weren't an option either. I was trapped on the second floor. The footsteps grew louder, now ascending the staircase. Desperation took over, and I darted into the master bedroom, locking the door behind me. It wouldn't hold for long, but it might buy me some time. I could hear them in the hallway, trying each door. It was only a matter of moments before they reached me. My eyes darted to the window. It was my only chance. Rushing to it, I threw it open, the cool night air hitting my face. I looked down. It was a long drop to the backyard, but just below was a sloped section of the roof. If I could slide down it, I might make it to the pool without breaking any bones. The doorknob rattled violently, followed by a loud thud as someone slammed against the door. Time was running out. Climbing onto the window ledge, I braced myself. Another crash came from the door, and the wooden frame splintered. Taking a deep breath, I prepared to leap into the unknown. I let myself fall. The shingles of the roof scraped against my skin as I slid, desperately trying to control my descent. I hit the gutter hard, tumbling over the edge and plummeting the last few meters. I landed in the pool with a splash, the shock of the cold water knocking the air from my lungs. For a moment, I just floated there, dazed. Then survival instinct kicked in. I swam to the edge and pulled myself out, gasping and coughing. I could hear shouts from inside the house. They knew I had escaped. Soaking wet and trembling, I bolted toward the backyard fence. I barely managed to climb over it just as the back door burst open. Beams of flashlights pierced through the darkness behind me. I ran harder than I had ever run in my life, through backyards, down alleyways, across streets. I had no destination in mind, only an overwhelming need to put as much distance as possible between me and that house. Eventually, I found myself at a 24-hour diner on the edge of town. The waitress gave me a concerned look as I stumbled inside. I must have been a sight. "Honey, are you okay?" she asked, already reaching for the phone. I nodded, still struggling to catch my breath. I need to call the police." The next few hours were a blur of questions and statements. I told them everything, the cameras, the attic, the intruder. At first, they seemed skeptical, but something about my demeanor must have convinced them I was telling the truth. They dispatched a team to the house. What they found was exactly as I had described: cameras, surveillance equipment in the attic, everything. But there was no sign of the intruder. Whoever had been watching me was gone, vanished into the night. The homeowners, who were vacationing in Europe, swore they knew nothing about it. The investigation, they told me, was ongoing, but it might take time before they had real answers. Meanwhile, I was left to pick up the pieces of my shattered sense of security. I moved in with a friend. I couldn't bear the thought of being alone. Every unexpected noise made me jump. Flickering lights made me shudder. Sleep became a luxury I could rarely afford. But the worst part was the relentless question that haunted my every waking moment. Why me? What had made me the target of such an elaborate scheme? Were they still out there, watching, waiting for another opportunity? I don't know if I'll ever truly feel safe again. The world feels darker now, filled with hidden dangers and invisible eyes. But I survived. I escaped. And whatever comes next, I'll face it head on. After all, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, right? I just hope I never have to test that theory again. The forest was supposed to be my escape, a chance to clear my head and reconnect with nature. Instead, it turned into a nightmare that would haunt me for years. I never imagined that a simple camping trip could become a fight for survival against an invisible enemy lurking among the trees. It all began innocently enough. I had been stressed at work for months, burning the candle at both ends with long hours and a never-ending project. When I finally finished, I knew I needed to disconnect. A solo camping trip in the Cascade Mountains seemed perfect, just me, my tent, and miles of untouched wilderness. I had camped many times before, but always with friends or organized groups. This would be my first time truly alone. The idea was both thrilling and slightly intimidating. I chose a remote location, a day's hike from the nearest ranger station. It was early autumn, with the leaves just starting to change, painting the forest in vibrant shades of red and gold. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and earth. The hike into the wilderness was peaceful yet more challenging than I had anticipated. By the time I arrived at my chosen spot, a small clearing near a bubbling brook, my muscles ached pleasantly from the effort. Setting up camp, I built a small fire and settled in to watch the sunset, feeling more at ease than I had in months. That first night passed without incident. I slept better than I had in weeks, lulled by the gentle sounds of the forest. The next morning, I awoke early, eager to explore the surroundings. I spent the day hiking, snapping photos, and soaking in the tranquility of nature. It was exactly what I needed, a complete disconnection from the chaos of everyday life. As evening approached, I returned to camp, looking forward to another night under the stars. But that's when things began to go wrong. As I neared the campsite, I noticed something strange. The air smelled different. There was an acrid, almost chemical tang that made no sense in the heart of the forest. I stopped in my tracks, suddenly alert. The woods were quieter than they should have been. The usual symphony of birds and insects was gone. An uneasy feeling began to creep over me. Moving cautiously, I scanned the trees, searching for anything out of the ordinary. At first glance, everything seemed normal. My tent was untouched. My gear was exactly where I had left it. But then I saw them, fresh footprints in the soft dirt near my fire pit. They weren't mine. My heart started pounding. Someone had been at my camp while I was away. But who? And why? I was debating whether to pack up and leave when I heard voices in the distance. Faint but drawing closer. Instinctively, I crouched behind a fallen log, peering through the underbrush. Two men emerged from the trees on the far side of the clearing. They wore dark clothing, heavy boots, and gloves. Each carried a large duffel bag. Their movements were deliberate, as if they were familiar with the area. "This spot will work," one of them said, dropping his bag with a metallic thud. "Far enough from the main trails, but still accessible." The other man nodded, his sharp gaze sweeping the area. When his eyes passed over my hiding spot, I held my breath, willing myself to become invisible. "Let's get it set up," he said. "We need to be operational before nightfall." They began unpacking their bags, and my blood ran cold as I saw what they contained. Chemical jugs, tubing, hot plates, all the components of a mobile drug lab. I had stumbled upon a methamphetamine production operation in the middle of the national forest. I knew I needed to get out of there and call for help. But I was trapped. Any movement could give away my position, and I didn't know what these men were capable of. I had no doubt that these men would eliminate any witnesses without hesitation. So I waited, barely breathing, as they set up their lab. The acrid smell of chemicals grew stronger, burning my nostrils. I watched them mix ingredients with terrifying efficiency. These weren't amateurs. This was a professional operation. Hours went by. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the clearing. I was stiff from remaining still for so long, my muscles screaming for relief. But the fear of being discovered kept me frozen in place. When darkness finally fell, more men arrived. I counted 5 in total, each exuding the same dangerous aura. They spoke in low voices, discussing distribution routes and meeting points. It didn't take long for me to realize I was overhearing details of a major drug trafficking network. I shifted my legs slightly, trying to ease the cramp that had formed. It was a mistake. A twig snapped under my weight, the sound cutting through the stillness of the night like a gunshot. Everyone in the clearing froze. "What was that?" one of the men asked, his hand moving instinctively to his waist, where I could make out the silhouette of a gun. "Probably an animal," another replied, though his voice betrayed doubt. "Check it out," the first man ordered. "We can't take any chances." 2 of them began moving in my direction, their flashlights sweeping through the underbrush. I knew I couldn't stay there. It was only a matter of time before they found me. I had to run. Taking a deep breath, I bolted from my hiding spot, sprinting toward the trees on the far side of the clearing. Shouts erupted behind me, followed by the sound of footsteps giving chase. I ran blindly through the forest, branches slashing at my face, roots threatening to trip me with every step. I could hear them closing in, their familiarity with the terrain giving them an advantage. They were less exhausted than I was. A gunshot rang out, the sharp crack echoing through the forest. The bullet was past my ear and buried itself in a nearby tree. The sound spurred me on, fear fueling my adrenaline. I had no plan, no destination in mind. My only thought was to put as much distance as possible between me and them. But I knew I couldn't run forever. I needed to hide, to find a way to lose them. Up ahead, the ground began to slope downward, and I heard the sound of rushing water. It had to be the stream where I'd camped earlier. If it was wide enough, maybe I could use it to throw them off my trail. I pushed my body to its limits, sprinting in that direction. The shouts of the men grew louder behind me, closing the gap. Another gunshot rang out, closer this time, followed by the sharp crack of impact against rocks. Finally, the trees parted and I found myself standing on the edge of a steep cliff. Below me, about 30 feet down, the river roared with an unforgiving intensity, swollen by the recent rains. Its powerful current glistened under the pale, ghostly light of the moon. I didn't think twice. Just as another gunshot echoed behind me, I jumped. The air seemed to freeze around me as I fell. The world slowed down, and for a moment, there was only silence. Then I hit the water with a force that knocked every last breath from my lungs. The icy impact sent shockwaves through my body. The current grabbed hold of me immediately, throwing me against jagged rocks like a ragdoll. The river was relentless, a beast that showed no mercy. I let it carry me, knowing that in these conditions, the men chasing me wouldn't dare follow. I didn't know how long I remained in the river. Minutes? Hours? Time had lost all meaning. Eventually, the violent rush began to ease, and with the last ounces of strength I had left, I clawed my way to the shore. I collapsed onto the gravel, my body trembling violently from the cold. My clothes were soaked, clinging to my skin like dead weight. Every muscle screamed in pain, yet I could barely move. When I finally summoned enough strength to sit up, reality struck me like a thunderclap. I had no idea where I was. The dense forest surrounded me, endless and suffocating. I had no supplies, no map, and no sense of direction. My only comfort was the fact that I was alive. That single truth was all that mattered. For the next 2 days, I followed the river, clinging to it like a lifeline. Hunger gnawed at me, but I survived on a handful of berries I recognized as safe. I drank straight from the river, the water icy and pure. Sleep was a luxury I couldn't afford. Fear kept me awake, the fear that they were still out there, searching. On the 3rd day, delirium and exhaustion pushed me to my limits. Just as I thought I couldn't go any farther, I stumbled upon a hiking trail. The sight of it was a beacon of hope in my desolation. I followed it with what little energy I had left until, finally, I saw a ranger station. My legs buckled as I reached it, and I collapsed on the ground. The rangers were stunned as I recounted my harrowing ordeal. Their faces shifted from disbelief to horror as my story unfolded. They contacted the authorities immediately, and soon the DA launched a massive operation to investigate the site I described. When the authorities reached the location, the lab was gone. The men who had pursued me vanished without a trace, leaving behind only remnants of their presence: abandoned chemical containers, trampled brush, and the faint, sinister echoes of their illegal activities. In the weeks and months that followed, I gave countless statements to the authorities. The information I provided helped dismantle portions of a sprawling drug trafficking network operating deep within the forests of the Pacific Northwest. Multiple arrests were made, but the men I encountered that night were never found. Even now, I still camp in the woods, but never alone. What was once my sanctuary now feels tainted, every rustle of leaves, every shadow playing tricks on my mind. The logical part of me knows the odds of encountering those men again are slim, but logic does little to soothe the memories of that terrifying night. Sometimes, in my dreams, I'm back there, running through the dark forest, the sound of footsteps closing in behind me. I wake up gasping, drenched in sweat, tangled in the sheets, as if I never truly escaped. And the ghostly smell of chemicals in my nostrils lingers. They say what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. I'm not sure I believe that anymore. But I do know this: I survived. And every day since has been a gift I refuse to take for granted. The forest taught me a harsh lesson about the darkness that can lurk in the most beautiful places. But it also revealed a strength within me I never knew I had. For that, at least, I am grateful. Music fades in softly. From the moment I saw his thumb poking out of the frayed sleeve of his jacket, I knew I should have kept driving. But the rain poured down in relentless sheets, and there was something in his eyes that made me stop. That decision would haunt me for the rest of my life. It was just past midnight. I was heading home after a late shift at the hospital. The highway stretched out in front of me, empty and shrouded in darkness. My headlights barely pierced the torrential rain, illuminating only a few meters ahead. I was exhausted, the bone-deep fatigue that comes from 12 hours of standing, dealing with other people's emergencies. Maybe that's why I didn't notice the hitchhiker sooner. He stood on the shoulder, barely visible through the downpour. His figure was drenched, his clothes clinging to his slender frame. As I slowed down, he turned toward me, his face momentarily lit by my headlights. "Just a little farther," he said, his voice surprisingly soft. "My car broke down. I'm trying to get to the next town. I'd really appreciate a ride." I hesitated. Every instinct screamed at me to keep driving, to leave the stranger in my rearview mirror. But the rain showed no sign of letting up, and I couldn't bring myself to abandon someone in this weather. "Get in," I said, unlocking the door. He slid into the passenger seat, bringing with him the sharp smell of wet clothes, and something else I couldn't quite place. "Thanks, man," he said, flashing me a grateful smile. "You're a lifesaver." I merged back onto the road, the windshield wipers struggling to keep up with the storm. "I'm Mark," I offered, trying to break the awkward silence that had settled between us. "John," he replied, rubbing his hands together for warmth. "I really appreciate this. Not many people would stop on a night like this." We drove in silence for a few minutes, the rhythmic swish of the wipers the only sound. I stole glances at John when I could. He was younger than I'd initially thought, probably around 25. His clothes were worn but clean, and he had an almost boyish look about him. "So, what happened to your car?" I asked, more to fill the silence than out of genuine curiosity. John shrugged. "Old Junker finally gave out. I was hoping to make it to my sister's place." He trailed off, staring out the window into the rain-slicked darkness. Something about his story didn't quite add up, but I chalked it up to my exhaustion and focused on the road ahead. We'd been driving for about 20 minutes when John spoke again. "Do you mind taking a little detour? There's a turnoff that'll get us there faster." I frowned. "I thought you said you were headed to the next town." "Yeah, my sister lives just outside of it. This way's quicker. Trust me." Against my better judgment, I took the exit he pointed to. The road narrowed, winding through a dense forest. If anything, the rain seemed to intensify, hammering against the car. "Are you sure this is the right way?" I asked, unease creeping into my voice. John nodded, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "Just a little farther." We kept driving. The trees pressed in on either side, their shadows dancing in the headlights. I was about to suggest turning back when John suddenly said, "Stop here." I slowed down, peering through the rain-streaked windshield. There was nothing ahead, just trees. And darkness. There was nothing here. The words died in my throat as I felt something cold and hard press against my ribs. Slowly, I turned my head to see John holding a knife. Every trace of his earlier kindness vanished from his face. "Turn off the engine and hand me the keys," he said, his voice low and menacing. My heart pounded so loudly I was certain it could be heard over the rain. With trembling hands I obeyed, shutting off the car and passing him the keys. "Now, get out of the car." Slowly. I pushed the door open, the rain intensifying as I stepped into the storm. The downpour soaked me instantly, and the cold bit into my skin. John followed closely, the knife still pointed at me, an unspoken threat in every step. "What do you want?" I managed to stammer, my voice barely a whisper. He smiled, but it wasn't the warm, friendly smile I had seen earlier. This was the smile of a predator. "Everything you've got," he said. "Wallet, phone, watch. Hand them over. Then we're going for a little walk." I handed him my belongings, my mind racing. We were miles from anywhere, caught in the middle of a relentless storm. Even if I could overpower him, where would I go? John gestured toward the shadowy line of trees with the knife. "Start walking." I stumbled forward, the underbrush clawing at my clothes. Branches lashed against my face, and the mud sucked at my shoes with every step. The rain was merciless, drenching me to the bone and leaving me shivering and miserable. John stayed close behind, occasionally jabbing me with the knife to keep me moving. After what felt like hours, but was likely just 20 minutes, we emerged into a small clearing. In the center stood a dilapidated cabin, its windows dark and empty like hollow eyes. "In there," John ordered, shoving me toward the door. The inside of the cabin was damp and reeked of mildew. The furniture was rotten, the peeling wallpaper barely clinging to the walls. A dim flashlight sat on a wobbly table, casting eerie, flickering shadows that danced across the room. "Sit," John barked, motioning to a rickety chair in the corner. I sank into it, my legs weak and trembling. From a backpack I hadn't noticed before, he pulled out a length of rope. "Hands behind your back." I hesitated for a moment too long. John's eyes narrowed, and he stepped closer, the knife glinting in the dim light. Reluctantly, I complied, feeling the rough fibers of the rope bite into my wrists as he tied me to the chair. Finally, I found my voice. "Why are you doing this?" John finished the knot and stepped back, studying me with cold, calculating eyes. "Why does anyone do anything?" he replied. "Money. Power. Survival. Take your pick." He began pacing the small room, flipping the knife in his hand with a disturbing ease. "You see, Mark, yeah, that's your name, isn't it? I've learned that people like you, the Good Samaritans, are the easiest to fool. So eager to help. So trusting. Makes my job a whole lot simpler." "Your job?" I asked, a chill running down my spine that had nothing to do with my soaked clothes. He smiled again, that same predatory grin that made my stomach churn. "Yeah," he said. "People like you end up in situations like this all the time. And me? I just take advantage. What are you going to do to me?" I asked, my voice trembling. John leaned against the wall, casually flipping the knife between his fingers. "That depends on you," he said, his tone almost conversational. "Here's how this works. First, we'll call your bank. You'll transfer all your funds to an account I control. Then we'll move on to your credit cards. We'll take everything we can get out of you." He paused, fixing his cold, penetrating gaze on me, a look that froze the blood in my veins. Then, he let the question hang in the air, the threat implicit and as clear as day. A knot formed in my throat as I grasped the magnitude of the situation. This man didn't just want to destroy me financially. My very survival was on the line. Escape wasn't an option, not at that moment. As if reading my thoughts, John let out a low, sinister chuckle. "Don't even think about playing the hero. Even if you somehow manage to free yourself, which you won't, you'll never make it out of this forest alive. We're miles from anywhere." He turned his back to me and began rummaging through the bag he had brought. Seizing the moment, I tested the ropes binding my hands, but they were far too tight. There was no easy way out. "Well," he said finally, turning back to me with my phone in hand. "Let's get started, shall we? Give me your bank's number." What followed was a nightmare. Endless phone calls made under the constant threat of his knife. Helpless, I watched as all my savings vanished, my credit cards were maxed out, and loans were taken in my name. With every transaction, it felt like another piece of my future was being erased. When it was over, I was physically and emotionally drained. John, on the other hand, seemed quite pleased with himself, humming a tune as he neatly packed away the papers in my now-dead phone. "Well, Mark, I must say, you've been a real model citizen," he said, his tone almost conversational. "Almost makes me feel bad about what comes next." He approached me with the knife in hand, and for a moment, I was certain it was the end. But instead of stabbing me, he cut the ropes that held me to the chair. "Remember what I said about choices?" he asked, stepping back. "Well, here's yours. That door leads to the forest. If you're lucky, maybe you'll find your way back to civilization." He gestured to the knife now resting on the table. "Or you can try to fight your way out of this. But I wouldn't recommend it." With that, he picked up his bag, walked to the door, and added, "Oh, and Mark? If I were you, I'd wait at least an hour before stepping outside, just in case." Then he was gone. I was alone in the cabin, the sound of rain pattering on the roof and the crushing weight of what had just happened pressing down on me. I don't know how long I sat there, stunned and trembling. When I finally found the strength to move, I stumbled out of the chair. Men like John, I've since learned, are experts at vanishing. Months later, I'm still dealing with the aftermath. My credit is ruined, my savings gone. I flinch at every shadow and distrust every act of kindness. But I'm alive. Slowly, I'm rebuilding my life. If there's one thing I've learned from that night, it's this. The most dangerous predators are often the ones who look like ordinary people. The memory of that night still haunts me. Sometimes, when I'm alone at home or driving late at night, I feel that same tension in the air, as if something is wrong, even when nothing is. There are nights when I wake up drenched in sweat, reliving the moment John pointed the knife at me, or the sound of branches crunching underfoot as he led me deeper into that dark forest. I haven't offered a ride to a stranger since, not even the thought crosses my mind. What once seemed like a simple act of kindness now feels like a potential death sentence. The police investigated for weeks after the incident but found no trace of John, or my car. The officers assured me they were doing everything they could, but their expressions told a different story. John, as they said, was like a ghost. I've tried to rebuild my life. I've changed all my bank accounts, reported the fraud to credit card companies, and signed up for identity protection services. But the deepest scars aren't financial, they're mental. Every time my phone rings with an unknown number, I tense up. Every time I hear footsteps behind me on the street, my heart races. Even at home, I lock every door and window, something I never used to think about. What unsettles me most is how methodical John was. He wasn't desperate or impulsive, he was calculated, meticulous. Everything about him suggested this wasn't his first time. His system, as he called it, had likely ruined the lives of others long before mine. And yet, somewhere out there, he's still free, a ghost lurking in the shadows, waiting for his next victim. And even though I managed to make it out alive, I can't help but wonder if one day our paths will cross again. There are nights when I lie awake, haunted by thoughts of what might have happened if I had chosen differently. What if I had stayed seated in that cabin? What if I had grabbed that knife on the table and tried to fight back? But then, my mind always drifts back to his smile, predatory, calculated. That smile made it clear he had planned for everything, that any resistance on my part would only have worsened my fate. I survived because I played his game. I survived because I remained just submissive enough not to provoke something far worse. Fear is a strange thing. It can paralyze you, but it can also keep you alive. That night, my fear saved me. But now, it lingers, a shadow that never completely fades. Just when I think I've moved past it, some small detail, a man standing too still in a dark corner, a car tailing me for what feels like too long, sends me hurtling back to that cabin, back to that moment of pure helplessness. For now, I'm trying to take life one day at a time. I've learned to be more cautious, more aware of my surroundings. I no longer take my safety for granted. But I refuse to let fear rule my life entirely. I know I will never again be the person I was before that night, but I also know this: I'm alive. And that's something I won't let him take away from me. Still, one question torments me: what if he finds me again? That uncertainty, that possibility, is what keeps me vigilant. Because, at the end of the day, the real danger isn't the monsters we imagine lurking under our beds. The true threat comes from the human predators hiding in plain sight. The moment I pulled that old painting off the wall and saw the small red light blinking behind it, I knew my life would never be the same. What I thought was a charming fixer-upper was about to become my personal house of horrors. I had always dreamed of owning my own home, a place where I could plant roots and leave my mark. When I came across the listing for the old Victorian house on Maple Street, it seemed too good to be true. The price was shockingly low for the area. Sure, it needed some obvious repairs, but the structure was solid. The real estate agent, a chipper woman named Karen, was almost too eager to close the deal. Looking back, I should have seen that as a warning sign. But I was blinded by the excitement of finally owning a place to call my own. Move-in day was a whirlwind of boxes, furniture, and excited plans for renovations. Everything seemed perfect, until that night. I was hanging a mirror in the hallway when I noticed something odd behind one of the old paintings left by the previous owner. Driven by curiosity, I removed the painting, only to find myself staring at a small, blinking red light. At first, I thought it might be part of some outdated security system. But as I examined it more closely, a growing sense of dread overtook me. It wasn't just any light, it was a camera. A very small, very modern camera. My heart racing, I began to search the rest of the house. In the living room, I found another hidden camera inside an air vent. In the kitchen, there was one concealed behind the microwave. Even in the bathroom, I discovered a tiny lens tucked behind the mirror. By the time I was done, I had uncovered at least a dozen hidden cameras scattered throughout the house. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Someone had been watching me. Judging by the placement of some of the cameras, they hadn't just been watching, they had been spying on my most private moments. I felt violated, exposed. I was terrified, wondering who had installed these cameras. Was it the previous owner, the real estate agent, or was it someone completely different? With trembling hands, I called the police. They arrived quickly, and I showed them each camera I had found. The officers, their faces serious, began documenting everything. They told me they would need to bring in a specialist to remove the cameras and analyze them for clues about who might have installed them. As they worked, I sat on the front porch, trying to process what was happening. The house, which just hours before had filled me with hope, now felt tainted, unsafe. I couldn't stop thinking about everything I had done since I moved in, those private moments that could have been captured and watched by, who knows, who? The police finished their initial investigation around midnight. They advised me not to stay the night in the house while they continued their work. I mechanically nodded, threw some clothes into a bag, and headed to a nearby hotel. That night I barely slept. My mind kept spinning with questions and fears. Who was watching me? What did they want? And, the most terrifying thought of all, they were still out there. The next morning, I met with a detective at the police station. She was a serious woman named Rodriguez, with kind eyes that contrasted sharply with her professional demeanor. "Miss Johnson," she began, "I'm not going to sugarcoat this. The situation is serious. The cameras we found in your house are high-end, professionally installed. This is not the work of an amateur." My stomach sank. "Do you know who did it?" I asked, dreading the answer. Detective Rodriguez shook her head. "Not yet, but we're investigating. We've reviewed the property records and are looking into everyone who had access to the house over the past few years. Previous owners, real estate agents, maintenance workers, everyone." She paused and looked at me with a steely gaze. "In the meantime, I have to ask. Is there anyone who might want to spy on you? An ex, someone you've had problems with?" I shook my head, feeling a bit offended by the suggestion. "No, nothing like that. I'm pretty boring, honestly. I can't imagine why anyone would want to watch me." Rodriguez nodded, seemingly satisfied with my answer. "All right. We'll keep investigating. We've removed all the cameras we found and we'll send a team back for another inspection, just to make sure we haven't missed anything. But, Miss Johnson, I have to be honest with you. Your house is now a crime scene. It might be a while before you can go back." I nodded, feeling a mix of relief and despair. On one hand, I couldn't imagine going back to that house, knowing what had happened there. On the other, it was my home, and according to the timestamps in the most recent records, I still lived there. I slammed the laptop shut, my heart pounding in my chest. I thought finding answers would help, but instead, I felt more scared than ever. The violation of my privacy wasn't limited to the house. It had extended to every aspect of my life. As I sat there, trying to figure out what to do next, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. My hands trembled as I opened the message. It was simple, but enough to freeze me to the core. "Enjoying the house, Sarah? Don't worry, I'm still watching. Always watching." In that moment, I realized that this nightmare was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The first call came at 5:17 a.m. I remember it clearly because I was staring at the clock, wishing the hands would move faster, counting the minutes until my shift was over. I should have never answered, but I did. and that's where the nightmare began. My name is Alex, and I work the midnight shift at WKRP, a small radio station in the middle of nowhere in Ohio. Normally it's an easy job. I play music, take a few requests, and try not to fall asleep most nights. The hardest part is staying awake, but tonight was different. It all started like any other night. I arrived around midnight, took over for the afternoon DJ, and settled in for 6 hours of classic rock and the occasional listener call. The studio was small, just a soundboard, a couple of monitors, and a window that looked out onto the empty station parking lot. Not much, but it was my domain from midnight to 6 in the morning. The first few hours went by without incident. I played the usual mix of Led Zeppelin, Pink Floyd, and Bob Seger, peppered with some local ads and weather updates. It was a quiet night, even by our standards. No calls, no requests, just me and the music. Then, at 1:01 a.m., the request line lit up. I picked up the phone with my usual greeting. "You're live on WKRP. What can I play for you tonight?" There was silence on the other end. Just as I was about to hang up, thinking it was a prank, I heard slow, deliberate breathing. "Hello?" I said, feeling uneasy. "Is someone there? Put something on for me." A male voice whispered, almost inaudible, with a strange quality I couldn't place. "Sure," I replied, trying to sound cheerful. "What would you like to hear?" "Surprise me," he said, and then the line went dead. I shrugged it off. Nighttime listeners can be strange sometimes, and this wasn't the weirdest request I'd ever received. I played Hotel California by the Eagles and went back to scrolling through my phone. 15 minutes later, the phone rang again. It was the same number. "WKRP, what can I do for you?" I answered. "You have good taste," the voice said, the same man. I was sure of it. "What else can you play for me?" A shiver ran down my spine. Something about his tone unsettled me. Sure," I said, trying to stay calm. "Any preferences?" "I trust your judgment," he replied, then hung up again. Now I was genuinely unnerved. I glanced out the window, half expecting to see someone in the parking lot, but it was empty, save for my own car parked under the flickering light of a street lamp. I played Stairway to Heaven, more to calm myself than for any other reason. As the final notes of the song faded, the phone rang once more. I stared at it, hesitant. Part of me wanted to ignore it, let it ring until whoever it was got tired and gave up. But I knew I couldn't do that. My job was to answer, even if I was scared. "WKRP," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "I can see why people listen to you," the man said, his voice now sharper, more dangerous. "The way you pick your songs, the way you speak, it's captivating." My blood froze. "Who are you?" I demanded. The man let out a soft laugh, a sound that made my skin crawl. "Just a fan, Alex. A very dedicated fan." He knew my name. How could he possibly know my name? We never used our real names on air. My DJ handle was The Night Owl. "Look," I said, trying to stay composed. "I don't know who you are, and I don't want to. But this isn't funny. Please don't call again." "Oh, I will," he replied. "I'm closer than you think, Alex. I'm watching you." The line went dead. My hands shook as I set the receiver down. I looked around the small studio, suddenly feeling very exposed. The windows, which usually made the space feel less claustrophobic, now seemed like huge vulnerabilities. Anyone could be outside, watching me. I had no idea what was happening. I tried to convince myself that it was just some lunatic trying to scare me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was truly being watched. The next hour passed in a blur of paranoia. Every noise startled me, and I kept glancing out the window, checking every shadow. The phone remained eerily silent, but somehow that was worse. The anticipation was unbearable. At 3:02 in the morning, it rang again. I answered without saying a word. You should be more careful, Alex, the voice said, its tone calm, almost soothing, making it all the more terrifying. You never know who could be listening or watching. What do you want? I whispered, my throat dry. Let's play a game, the voice replied. It's simple. I'll give you a choice of songs to play. If you pick the right one, nothing happens. If you get it wrong, well, let's just say the consequences won't be pleasant. My mind was in chaos. This couldn't be real. Things like this only happen in movies or novels, right? But the fear I felt was all too real. I'm hanging up now, I said, trying to steady my voice. I'm calling the police. You wouldn't do that if I were you, came the cold reply. Not if you want your sister to stay safe. My heart stopped. What did you say? I asked, my voice almost gone. Sarah, right? She lives on Elm Street, in that lovely little house with the blue shutters. It would be such a shame if something were to happen to her. Panic overwhelmed me. How did he know that? How did he know about Sarah? How did he know where she lived? Leave her out of this, I choked out, my voice cracking. That's up to you, Alex. Play the game, and everyone stays safe. Refuse, well, I think you know what happens then. I knew it could be a bluff. Maybe he had no idea who Sarah was and was just saying these things to scare me. But what if it wasn't a bluff? Could I risk it? All right, I said, finally defeated. I'll play. Excellent, the voice said, almost amused. Let's begin. Easy one. Sympathy for the Devil or House of the Rising Sun? My mind raced. Was there a right answer? Was he looking for something in particular, or was this just part of his twisted game? House of the Rising Sun, I whispered, my voice barely audible. There was a long pause, one that felt like it would never end. Good choice, the voice finally said. Now put it on. With trembling hands, I searched for the song and played it. As the first notes filled the air, I realized I had been holding my breath. Well done, Alex, the voice said when I answered again. You're a natural at this game. Let's try another one. And so it went for the next 2 hours. He would call, give me a song choice, and I had to pick. Sometimes he'd give me cryptic clues, other times it seemed completely random. All the while, I was painfully aware that one wrong move could mean disaster. As the clock inched closer to 5 a.m., I was a bundle of nerves. My shirt was soaked with sweat, and my hands shook so much I could barely control the soundboard. But I had made it this far without a mistake. Then the line rang one last time. You've done well, Alex, the voice said. I'm impressed. But now, it's time for the final round. If you pick correctly, it's over. If you get it wrong, well, I think you know what happens. I swallowed hard. What's the choice? I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. Don't Fear the Reaper or Stairway to Heaven. Choose wisely. I froze. Both songs were about death in some way. Was that the connection? Or was I overthinking it? My mind raced, trying to find hidden meanings or clues I might have missed. But deep down, I knew there was no way to know which answer was the right one. In the end, I trusted my gut. Stairway to Heaven, I said, my voice almost inaudible. The silence that followed was the longest of my life. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears, feel the cold sweat dripping down my back. Finally, the voice spoke again. Congratulations, Alex. You've won the game. Relief flooded through me, so intense it almost hurt. Is it over? I asked, barely believing it. For now, the voice replied. I could hear the smile in his voice. You've proven to be a worthy opponent. I'm eagerly looking forward to our next game. The line cut off for the last time, and I stood there, stunned, as the first rays of dawn filtered through the window. The night had ended, but I knew the nightmare was far from over. Whoever this man was, whatever game he was playing, I had the feeling that this was only the beginning. When the morning DJ arrived, I practically ran to my car, constantly looking over my shoulder. I called Sarah the moment I got home, relieved to hear her groggy voice answer. She was fine, completely unaware of the events of the previous night. I didn't tell her what had happened. How could I? Everything seemed so unreal in the light of day. But as I crawled into bed, exhausted and anxious, I knew one thing for sure. I would never feel safe in that radio booth again. And somewhere out there, a man with a chilling voice was waiting, planning his next move in a game I never agreed to play. The moment his headlights filled my rearview mirror, I knew this was not going to be an ordinary trip. What I didn't know was that those blinding headlights would lead me down a path of terror I never imagined, a path straight out of a nightmare. It was supposed to be a simple road trip, just me, my old Honda Civic, and 300 miles of highway between my city and my sister's wedding. I had driven this route a dozen times before, always choosing the scenic route through the mountains instead of the busy highway. The views were breathtaking, and the solitude was a welcome break from my hectic city life. I left late, around 9 p.m., thinking I would drive through the night and arrive just in time for the rehearsal dinner. The first few hours passed without incident. The radio kept me company as I navigated the dark, winding roads, my headlights cutting through the darkness of the forest on either side. Past midnight, I noticed the car behind me for the first time. At first, I didn't think much of it. Though this road wasn't heavily trafficked, it wasn't unusual to see other drivers, even at this hour. But as the minutes ticked by, I realized something strange. They weren't trying to pass me, nor were they falling behind. They kept a steady distance, just close enough for their headlights to flood my car with blinding light. I squinted, trying to make out the vehicle in my mirror. It looked like a large truck, but the glare made it difficult to see any details. A sense of unease began to settle in my chest. Why were they following so closely? There was plenty of space to overtake me on this stretch of road. I eased off the gas, allowing my car to slow down. If they wanted to pass, this was their chance. But they too slowed down, maintaining the same distance. My heart began to race. This wasn't normal. I pressed the accelerator, forcing my old Civic to go faster than I felt comfortable with on these mountain curves. But the truck kept pace with ease. That's when I saw another set of headlights behind the first. Another vehicle had joined in. Now there were two, tailing me closely. My hands grew clammy as I gripped the steering wheel. This couldn't be a coincidence. Two vehicles working together to follow me in the middle of nowhere in the dead of night. Trying to keep calm, I glanced at my phone. No signal. Of course, these mountain roads were notorious for poor coverage. Suddenly, the truck behind me flicked its lights on and off, a warning signal, or perhaps a message of some kind. My pulse quickened, the weight of the situation pressing down on me like a stone in my chest. It wasn't just a car behind me anymore. It wasn't just an ordinary drive. Something was happening, and I didn't know what it was, but I could feel it, deep down, in my bones, that I was being hunted. I had switched on the high beams 3 times in quick succession, flicking the switch momentarily, when suddenly, I heard a sound that froze my blood in its tracks, an ear-piercing, shrill honk of a truck horn. It wasn't a friendly greeting, nor a warning, it was a signal. The second vehicle, now clearly visible as an SUV, sped up and pulled alongside me, matching my speed. My heart raced as I glanced quickly at the side window, but the tinted glass blocked my view of the driver inside. Without warning, the SUV swerved towards me, attempting to ram into my car. I screamed and jerked the wheel, narrowly avoiding the collision. My tires screeched, struggling to keep the car under control as I fought to stay on the road. They were trying to force me off the highway. This was no longer just harassment. Whoever these people were, they intended to harm me. I slammed my foot down on the accelerator, pushing my aging Civic to its limit. The engine roared, and the speed shot up, 80, 90, 100 miles per hour. Driving at such a reckless speed on these winding roads was madness, but my survival instincts kicked in, pushing me forward. The SUV and the truck didn't fall behind. Now they were trying to corner me, one on each side, creating a trap, forcing me to slow down or risk a deadly collision. Ahead I spotted a detour, a narrow, unmarked road that led into the darkness. There was no time to think. I jerked the steering wheel sharply, my brakes howling in protest as I took the turn. I could hear the roar of their engines behind me as they attempted to follow, but their larger vehicles couldn't navigate the bend at the speed I was going. Now, on the dirt road, my car bounced and shook, tires rattling as I sped through the wilderness. Branches smacked against the windows, the sounds of the pursuit growing louder and closer. I couldn't afford to slow down, not even for a second. I knew it was only a matter of time before they caught up. I took random turns, with no sense of direction. My sole aim was to buy myself some time. Finally, the sounds of the engines behind me faded. I came to a halt on a narrow path, my car panting like it was alive. Silence enveloped the forest, but it wasn't reassuring. My heart pounded in my chest, and every shadow seemed to move. I moved cautiously down the path, hoping to catch sight of civilization. In the distance, a light appeared, a glimmer of hope. I approached, thinking I had found a house or a gas station. But as I drew closer, my stomach sank. It wasn't a home, it was a campsite. A small fire crackled in the center of a clearing, and a solitary figure, a gray-bearded old man, stood beside it. Cautious but desperate, I got out of the car and made my way toward the fire. The man looked up as I approached, his weathered face etched with concern. "Are you all right, miss?" he asked in a gravelly voice. My voice cracked as I recounted everything that had happened, the cars, the chase, the terror that still gripped me. The man listened in silence, nodding slowly as I spoke. When I finished, he let out a heavy sigh. "You're not the first to say something like that," he said, tossing another branch into the fire. "These mountains have a reputation. Cars that vanish. People who are last seen on this road." And nobody did anything. I asked to use his phone, but he didn't have one. He offered me to stay by the fire until dawn. That night, every sound in the forest made me jump. Every time the fire flickered, I expected to see those headlights approaching. By dawn, he gave me directions to the main road. When I finally arrived at a gas station, I called the police. They took my statement, but it was clear they couldn't do much without license plates, without detailed descriptions of the drivers. There was nothing to investigate. I got back on the road, this time taking the highway, with every car behind me putting my nerves on edge. Since that day, I haven't taken that route again. Now I avoid driving at night because I learned a truth I'll never forget. Sometimes, monsters don't hide in the darkness. They're there, behind the bright headlights, waiting. And if you ever feel watched on the road, if a car seems to follow you too closely, don't ignore it. It could be the difference between making it home or never making it back. The moment I saw the unmarked boxes being loaded onto that plane, I knew I had stumbled upon something I shouldn't have seen. What I didn't expect was that my night shift at the airport would turn into a fight for my life. I had been working the night shift at Millbrook International Airport for a few months. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it paid the bills, and I liked the peace and quiet of the airport at night. Most of the time, it was just me, a handful of security guards, and the occasional flight crew from a late-night flight. That night started like any other. I clocked in at 11 p.m., greeted Frank in security, and did my rounds through the cargo area. Everything was routine until around 2 a.m. when I heard the unmistakable sound of a plane taxiing. That was unusual. There were no scheduled flights at that hour, and unscheduled landings usually came with a considerable ruckus. But this plane arrived silently, almost stealthily. Curiosity got the best of me. I moved to the window that overlooked the tarmac, staying in the shadows. It was a cargo plane, no markings, no visible airline logos. As I watched, a group of men emerged from a hangar I thought was empty. They were dressed in dark clothing and moved with unsettling precision. The plane's cargo hold opened, and the men began unloading large wooden crates, all without any visible markings. My heart started to race. This was not normal cargo handling. Every package passing through this airport had to be registered, labeled, and tracked. These crates were anonymous, invisible to the system. The moment I saw the blood-stained tent, I knew my peaceful hiking trip had turned into a nightmare. What I didn't know was that I was about to become the prey in a macabre game of hide and seek. It had been a weekend I'd been planning for months, a solo trip, just me and nature. As an experienced hiker, I wasn't worried about the solitude. In fact, I welcomed it. I had carefully mapped out my route through the Cascade Mountains, excited for days of peace away from the world. The first day went as planned. I covered good ground, the weather was perfect, and the scenery was breathtaking. As evening fell, I found a perfect clearing to camp. After dinner, a freeze-dried meal, I decided to take a short evening walk before crawling into my sleeping bag. That's when I saw it. About 400 meters from my camp, partially hidden by the trees, there was another tent. At first, I didn't think much of it. Finding other hikers wasn't rare, even that far off the main trail. But the closer I got, the more it became clear something was wrong. The tent was torn apart, one side collapsed, the tarp ripped and dark stains, unmistakably blood, staining the green material. My heart began to race. I screamed, hoping someone would respond, but only the silence answered back. Cautiously, I moved closer. The blood formed a trail leading into the store. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the entrance aside and looked inside. The interior was a mess. Sleeping bags torn apart, equipment scattered everywhere, and more blood covering the floor. But there was no body, no sign of who had been there. I stepped back, stumbling. The tracks were human, leading from the store into the dense forest. But they weren't erratic or stumbling like I would expect from someone who was injured. They were firm, with regular steps, as if the person had deliberately walked away from the scene. A chill ran down my spine. This wasn't an accident. Something far more sinister was happening. I ran back to my camp with a clear plan in mind, pack my things and leave the area as quickly as possible. But while I was taking down my tent, something in the trees caught my attention. About 50 meters away, half hidden behind a tree, a figure was watching me. Our eyes met for a brief moment before the figure disappeared into the trees, moving with unnatural speed. Panic gripped me. I quickly shoved the rest of my belongings into my backpack and began to run. I didn't bother looking for the trail. I simply hacked my way through the forest, moving as far from the camp as possible. I could hear something moving behind me, the crunching of branches and leaves. My pursuer wasn't trying to be silent. My legs burned, and my breath became heavy, but I didn't stop. I knew that if I did, I wouldn't be getting back up. After what felt like hours, I tripped on a slope and tumbled to the bottom, my body slamming into roots and rocks. I lay there, gasping and dazed. When I finally managed to get up, I realized I had lost my backpack in the fall. All my gear, my map, and my emergency radio were left behind. I was completely alone, lost in the woods, and being chased by something or someone with no good intentions. As I tried to orient myself, I heard the crunching of footsteps again, this time approaching slowly. They were playing with me, dragging out the fear like a cat toying with a mouse before the final strike. I moved carefully, each step chosen with care to avoid making noise, but I couldn't help it. Every dry twig and every crackling branch made me flinch. Finally, in the distance, I saw a faint glow. It was a light. Hope surged within me as I made my way toward it. As I got closer, I saw it was a campfire. And by the fire, an older man with a long, gray beard sat smoking a pipe. "What brings you out here, young lady?" he asked, lifting his gaze from the fire. I ran toward him and told him everything: the bloody tent, the footprints, the figure chasing me. The man listened in silence, nodding gravely. "You're not the first to tell me something like this," he said finally. "These woods have a bad reputation. Many people disappear out here. Some say it's animals. Others, well, say it's not something natural." I spent the rest of the night beside the man's fire, startled by sounds coming from the woods. As dawn broke, the man gave me directions to return to a ranger station. "Remember," he warned, "the sun is not always your friend. Whatever is out there doesn't stop just because it's light." The journey back to the station was tense. Every crack of a branch made me whip my head around, expecting to see that figure emerge from the trees. When I arrived at the station, I reported everything. The rangers sent out a search party, but they found nothing. No bloody tent. No trace of what had happened. Years later, I still have nightmares about that night. I haven't camped alone since. I no longer look at the forest with the same fascination, because now I know that sometimes the real monsters aren't wild animals. Sometimes they are humans, and sometimes there's something else. If you ever find yourself in the forest, and you get that eerie feeling that someone is watching you, don't ignore it. It might just save your life. Because out there, deep in nature, not everyone is simply enjoying the scenery. Some are hunting, and you never know when you might become their prey. The moment I saw those unmarked crates being loaded onto that plane, I knew I had stumbled upon something I wasn't supposed to see. What I didn't expect, though, was that my night shift at the airport would soon turn into a fight for my life. I had been working the night shift at Millbrook International Airport for a few months. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it paid the bills, and I liked the quiet of the airport at night. Most of the time, it was just me, a handful of security guards, and the occasional flight crew of a red-eye flight. That night started like any other. I clocked in at 11 p.m., greeted Frank at security, and did my rounds around the cargo area. Everything was routine, until 2 a.m. That's when I heard the unmistakable sound of an airplane taxiing. That was rare. There were no scheduled flights at that hour, and unscheduled landings usually came with a lot of noise. But this plane came in silently, almost stealthily. My curiosity got the better of me. I headed to the window overlooking the tarmac, staying hidden in the shadows. It was a cargo plane, no visible airline markings. As I watched, a group of men emerged from a hangar I thought was empty. They were dressed in dark clothes, moving with unsettling precision. The cargo hold of the plane opened, and the men began unloading large wooden crates, each one unmarked. My heart started pounding. This wasn't normal cargo handling. Every package that came through this airport was supposed to be checked, labeled, and tracked. These crates were anonymous, vanishing from the system. I should have walked away then. I should have listened to that voice in my head telling me to go back to my rounds and forget what I'd seen. But something kept me there, watching as crate after crate was unloaded and carried into the hangar. And then something happened that made my blood run cold. One of the men tripped while carrying a crate, and it hit the ground with a loud thud. The lid of the crate popped open slightly, and under the dim light of the tarmac, something inside glinted. It looked like the barrel of a gun. My mind raced. Guns. They were smuggling guns through our airport. This was big. Dangerous. I needed to report it. But just as I turned to leave, my elbow bumped into a metal shelf next to the window. The sound rang out in the stillness of the night, like thunder on the tarmac. All the heads turned toward the window where I was hiding. I dropped to the floor, heart racing, praying they hadn't seen me. For what felt like an eternity, there was silence. Then I heard urgent, annoyed voices and the sound of footsteps moving toward the building. Panic surged through me. I had to get out of there. I scrambled to my feet and ran, not caring about the noise I was making now. Behind me, I could hear shouts and the pounding footsteps of those chasing me. I burst out of the cargo area and into the main terminal, my mind working at full speed. Where could I go? Who could I trust? I thought about heading to security, but then a terrifying thought stopped me cold. What if they were involved? What if the entire airport was compromised? I ducked into a maintenance closet, trying to catch my breath and think. I needed to call the police, but my phone was in my locker. There was a landline in the office, but that was on the other side of the terminal. I held my breath as I heard voices outside the closet. He can't have gone far. Find him. Do it quietly. We can't afford to draw attention. I gritted my teeth, heart hammering in my chest, as the footsteps passed by the door. When the noise faded, I allowed myself to breathe again, but I knew I couldn't stay there for long. It was only a matter of time before they started searching the area. I carefully opened the door. I stuck my head out cautiously, my eyes scanning the quiet, deserted terminal. Moving quickly yet carefully, I began to advance towards the office, using the check-in counters as cover. I was halfway there when I heard a scream. There! She's here! I ran, launching myself towards the office, ignoring the shouting and the footsteps chasing me. I slammed the door shut behind me and locked it with trembling hands. Grabbing the landline, I dialed 911. 911, what is your emergency? The operator's voice crackled. Jade, I panted. I'm at the Millbrook International Airport. They're trafficking weapons. They're trying to... The door slammed open, and the phone was yanked from my hand. I came face to face with a man holding a gun, his cold expression marred by a scar across his cheek. That was very stupid, he said, his voice calm, but laced with a deadly threat. They dragged me at gunpoint into the hangar. Two men held my arms tightly. Inside, I saw rows of crates stacked high, enough weapons to equip a small army. A well-dressed man I hadn't seen before approached. He looked me up and down with a mix of irritation and calculation. What do we do with her, boss? The man holding me asked. The well-dressed man sighed. This complicates things. We can't afford loose ends. But if one of the employees at the airport disappears, it'll raise suspicion. He turned to me. What's your name? Sarah, I whispered, barely audible. Well, Sarah, you've put us in a tough spot, he continued. I'm guessing I can't convince you to forget everything you've seen tonight, can I? I didn't answer. I was too terrified to speak. That's what I thought, he said, nodding slowly. Then, before he could issue any further orders, the wail of sirens filled the air. Everyone in the hangar froze. Impossible, the man with the gun growled. We cut the call before she could give details. The well-dressed man narrowed his eyes, looking at me with a mixture of respect and annoyance. Seems like our friend Sarah is smarter than we thought. He turned to the others. Pack everything up. Quickly. Don't leave a trace. In the chaos that followed, they bound my hands with tape and locked me inside a closet within the office, securing the door with something heavy. From within the closet, I could hear the roar of the plane's engines as it took off. When the police finally found me, the hangar was empty. The weapons were gone, and so were the men. A detective later explained. This goes deep. We've received calls from some very important people telling us to drop the case. They offered me protection, even a new identity. But I knew my life would never be the same again. Now, years later, I still move from place to place, always looking over my shoulder. Once you've seen the dark, hidden workings of the world, you can never unsee it. The moment I opened the package and saw what was inside, I knew my life would never return to normal. I had expected a routine delivery, but what I received pulled me into a dark, dangerous mystery that I could not ignore. It was a quiet afternoon when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting any packages, but when I opened the door, I found an ordinary cardboard box on my porch. It had no return address, only my name and address scribbled hastily. I thought it might be a mistake, but curiosity got the better of me. I opened the box on my dining table. Inside was a thick brown envelope and an object wrapped in dark cloth. First, I took the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message written in large, bold letters. Do not call the police. What you do with this will be up to you. They are watching you. My pulse quickened. I looked out the window, expecting to see something out of the ordinary. But the street was empty. I decided to open the wrapped object. Inside was a small, old, and worn leather notebook. I opened it carefully, and my eyes met disturbing drawings. Humanoid figures with elongated limbs, surrounded by symbols I didn't recognize. On the first few pages, there were notes written in small, tight handwriting. And nervous, they're coming for all of us. They found me. Time is running out. The notebook was filled with diagrams, dates, and locations, but nothing made sense. There were constant mentions of something called the Watcher. My instincts screamed at me to burn it and forget everything, but I couldn't. Something in those pages had ensnared me. I spent hours poring over them, desperately trying to find a connection. Finally, something unsettling appeared. There was a pattern between the dates and locations. One stood out. A location nearby, with a date matching the very night I was reading it. I couldn't let it go, couldn't ignore it. Against my better judgment, I decided to visit the place. It was an abandoned building on the outskirts of town, marked in the notebook. I didn't know what that meant, but I was determined to find out. I arrived before midnight. The place was in ruins, broken windows, walls covered in graffiti. I entered with only a flashlight, stepping cautiously through the debris-filled hallways. And then I heard it. A soft noise, like a distant murmur. My heart froze. My flashlight trembled in my hand. Is anyone here? My voice echoed through the silence, but there was no reply. The murmur continued, now much closer. I followed the sound down a hallway and into a room at the end. What I saw in that room made me stumble back in shock. In the center of the room was a circle drawn on the floor, surrounded by the same symbols from the notebook. Inside the circle stood a figure, unmoving, its head tilted to one side. It didn't look human. Tall, with limbs that were too long, and skin that was a sickly, grayish hue, almost glowing under the light of my flashlight. Before I could react, the figure lifted its head. Though it had no visible eyes, I could feel its gaze piercing through me. Suddenly, my flashlight flickered and went out. In the darkness, I heard a whisper, the same one I had heard before. But this time, it was clear. You shouldn't have come. I quickly turned my flashlight back on, but the figure had vanished. In its place, the circle on the floor now glowed with a faint red light. Fear consumed me, and without a second thought, I ran out of the building, not daring to look back. When I got home, I found something that made me scream. The notebook was open on my desk. I had left it closed, yet there were new notes written in the same frantic handwriting. Now, they're watching you. You can't escape. From that night on, strange things began to happen. The lights would flicker for no reason. Objects in my house would appear in places where I hadn't left them, and always, in the quietest moments, I could feel a presence, as though someone, or something, was with me in the room. I tried to get rid of the notebook, but it always found its way back to me. Whether in my mailbox or even on my bed, it didn't matter what I did. It felt as if I was trapped in a game I didn't understand. The dreams started too. Every night, I would see the figure standing at the edge of my bed, its elongated limbs, the absence of eyes, always watching. I would wake up screaming, but with each passing night, it felt like the dreams were becoming too real. Months have passed since that package arrived. Now I can no longer tell what's real and what isn't. I've researched everything I can about the Watcher, but all I've learned is that those who encounter it rarely survive long enough to share their story. Now I live with a constant, nagging feeling that I'm being watched. I see it in the shadows, in the reflections, in the corners of my home. I know it's only a matter of time before it comes for me. If you ever receive a package you weren't expecting, filled with strange or disturbing contents, don't do what I did. Don't open it. Don't follow the clues. Because once you're in its sights, there's no way out. The moment the strange noises started in the attic, I knew something was wrong with the house. What I didn't expect was discovering that I wasn't alone, and that what shared the house with me was something that defied all logic. I'd rented the house just a few weeks earlier. It was old, but charming. High ceilings, creaky wooden floors that groaned with each step, and a fireplace I planned to light when winter came. After years of living in cramped apartments, this house felt like a new beginning. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It wasn't long before the sounds started, scratching in the walls, footsteps in the attic when I was alone. I tried to convince myself it was just the house settling, old wood creaking and shifting. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. For days, the house remained eerily silent, its age only making itself known through the occasional creaks and groans of the old wood. At first, it seemed like the usual sounds you might expect from an old house. A floorboard that creaked here, a soft thump there. Nothing that would send a chill down your spine, nothing that could keep me up at night. I felt like I had finally found a place I could call my own, a sanctuary where I could rest in peace, alone for the first time in what felt like forever. But after a week of peace, things began to change. It all started one evening when I was reading in the living room. The noise was subtle at first, a faint rustling sound, almost as though something were moving around in the attic. I dismissed it, assuming it was just an animal, perhaps a mouse, or even a raccoon. I made a mental note to call an exterminator the next day, but the noises didn't stop. In fact, they grew more frequent and more unsettling. Light scratching, soft thumps, as if something small were crawling or shifting from one corner to another. Then, one night, I even heard what sounded like footsteps above me. I tried to tell myself it was all in my head, a product of my imagination playing tricks on me. But then, one early morning, I was jolted awake by a loud thud, like something heavy had fallen directly above my bedroom. My heart raced as I lay there in the dark, too scared to move, but unable to ignore it. I had to find out what was going on. The next day, I worked up the courage to go up to the attic. I grabbed a flashlight and steeled myself for whatever lay beyond the attic door. The stairs to the attic were hidden behind a small hatch in the hallway. I pulled it open, revealing an old wooden ladder that creaked under every step. The attic was dark, musty, and filled with boxes, old furniture covered in dusty sheets. The beam of my flashlight swept across the room, revealing nothing unusual, just the remnants of a past life long forgotten. But then I reached the far corner, and I froze. There, etched into the wooden floor were deep, jagged marks, long scratches, as if something had scraped across the surface. My heart began to beat faster as I followed the scratches with the flashlight. They led me to a shadowy corner where the light of my flashlight barely reached. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, just as I turned to leave, I heard it. A whisper, faint, almost too soft to hear, but it sent a wave of cold fear through me. I couldn't make out the words, but the feeling that washed over me was pure terror. My hands shook as I dropped the flashlight in my haste to flee down the stairs, slamming the hatch shut behind me with such force that the echo reverberated through the entire house. That night, sleep refused to come. I sat in my bed, wide awake, listening to every creak, every groan, convinced that whatever was in the attic was watching me from above. The fear was overwhelming. The next day, I called my friend Matt. I explained what had been happening, though he laughed at first, teasing me for letting my imagination run wild. But he agreed to come over and check the attic with me, just to ease my mind. Matt arrived, armed with a bigger flashlight and a baseball bat, joking that he was going to hunt down the hellish raccoon. that was supposedly haunting my home. I didn't share his enthusiasm, but I felt a little safer having him there. Together, we climbed up to the attic. This time, the air felt even darker, the shadows thicker, almost as if the light itself was being absorbed by the surrounding darkness. Matt carefully inspected every corner, moved boxes around, and even banged on the walls with his bat to make sure there were no hidden spaces or rooms. "Nothing here," he said, flashing me a triumphant smile. But just as he spoke, we both heard a loud, hollow thud, coming from the far side of the attic, from an old wooden chest we hadn't checked. Matt cautiously approached the chest, bat in hand, ready for anything. I stayed behind, my heart hammering in my chest. When he opened the chest, the first thing we saw was an old photograph, a family portrait, faded and worn with age. But something was wrong. The faces of the people in the photo were smeared, almost as if they had been scratched out or burned. Amid the photos, there were other strange objects, a lock of hair tied with a ribbon, an old pocket watch, and at the very bottom of the chest, an old doll with glass eyes that seemed to stare directly at us. Matt carefully lifted the doll, trying to make light of the situation. "This is weird," he said, though his voice lacked its usual casual tone. I could hear the tension in his voice, and it sent another chill down my spine. Then we heard it, another whisper, louder this time. The doll suddenly dropped from Matt's hands and rolled toward me. Before I could react, something shot out from the dark corner of the attic. It was fast, more shadow than shape, and it moved in an unnatural way, like its limbs were wrong, disjointed. Matt screamed as he raised the bat, but before he could strike, the figure lunged at him. I screamed, my legs moving on their own as I bolted down the stairs without looking back. Matt followed, panting and pale. "We have to get out of here!" he shouted, slamming the attic hatch shut behind him. We ran out of the house and didn't look back. I didn't return that night, or the nights that followed. I called in a paranormal expert, though I wasn't sure what to believe anymore. The man who arrived seemed to know exactly what he was doing. He went up to the attic with strange equipment, while Matt and I waited outside anxiously. After hours of silence, the expert came back down, looking even more serious than before. "There's something in this house," he said, his voice grim. "Something old and angry. I don't know how it started, but these things, they don't stay put. I suggest you leave. Don't wait any longer." I moved out within days, leaving most of my belongings behind. The house remains abandoned to this day. Every once in a while, I pass by and see the dark, empty windows of the attic staring back at me. But always I feel that sense of being watched, as if something is still there, waiting for me to return. I don't know what was living in that house, but I learned a lesson I'll never forget. If you ever hear noises in a place that should be empty, don't ignore them. Because sometimes, what lives in the darkness doesn't want to be discovered, and if you find it, it may never let you go. The moment I turned on the TV, I knew something was wrong. As soon as I saw the broadcast, I knew something was wrong. I hadn't expected anything out of the ordinary. I just wanted to disconnect for a bit after a long day. But what I saw on the screen pulled me into a mystery that blurred the line between reality and madness. It was just another Monday night. I got home, made myself something to eat, and collapsed onto the sofa, ready to unwind. When I turned on the TV, the channel that usually showed local news was broadcasting something completely different. Instead of a news segment, a blurry image of a dark room appeared. There was a flickering light on the ceiling and a wooden chair placed in the middle of the room. For a moment, I thought it was some kind of technical glitch, maybe a distorted signal. Then something moved in the corner of the screen. A figure appeared, blurred, almost impossible to make out in the darkness. It looked like a man, though I couldn't see his face clearly. He was hunched over, walking slowly toward the chair at the center. The camera didn't move. Everything felt too real, as if someone had set up a static camera to record the scene. The man sat in the chair, staring directly at the camera. Even though the image was blurry, something about his posture unsettled me deeply. He didn't speak, didn't move. He just sat there, staring at me through the screen. I tried changing the channel, but the remote didn't work. Suddenly, the volume shot up, and a sound began emanating from the speakers, a low buzz, like a swarm of bees mixed with something metallic. I shuddered and tried to turn off the TV, but the power button didn't work either. I looked back at the screen. The figure was still there, but now it seemed closer. I hadn't seen it move, but its indistinguishable face was now nearer to the camera. My head started spinning. The buzz grew deafening, and the room felt like it was closing in on me. That's when the man spoke. Although his voice didn't come through the speakers, I heard it clearly in my head. "Why are you watching?" I jumped off the sofa, my heart racing, and backed into the wall. My eyes never left the screen. The man kept speaking, though his mouth didn't move. "This isn't for you. You shouldn't be here." Then the image on the screen changed. It was no longer the dark room with the chair. Now it was my living room, my sofa, my table, even the plate I had left on the coffee table. But something was wrong with the picture. I wasn't alone. Behind the sofa, I could see a dark figure, barely visible in the shadows. I looked around, but there was no one there. I looked back at the screen, and now the figure was closer, right behind the sofa. Panic overwhelmed me. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, but there was no dial tone. The screen on my phone went completely blank. Suddenly, the TV turned off, leaving the room in an eerie silence. Seconds ticked by before I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere in the house. I looked down the hallway, where the light flickered faintly with every step I took toward it. The tapping grew louder. Finally, I realized it was coming from my bedroom. I slowly opened the door, holding my breath. In the center of the room was a chair, identical to the one I'd seen on the TV. It was empty, but the tapping continued. My mirror, its surface vibrating like water, was reflecting the figure of the man, staring at me from the other side. There was no visible expression on his face, but I felt his intent. He was inviting me to cross. "Come," his voice echoed in my head again. My head jerked back toward the door, and the man tilted his head, almost studying me. I ran out of the room and locked myself in the bathroom, turning on the light, trying to convince myself I was just imagining things. Minutes later, when I mustered the courage to leave, the mirror in my bedroom was intact, and the chair was gone. Since that night, things haven't been the same. Sometimes, when I turn on the TV, the image flickers briefly, and I see the room with the chair. I've stopped staring at the screen for too long, terrified that something might be watching me back. And every time I pass by a mirror, I feel like something is there, waiting. If your TV ever shows something that shouldn't be there, turn it off immediately. And if you can't turn it off, leave the house. Because sometimes, what watches you from the other side doesn't want you to look, but if you do, you might not be able to escape. The moment I saw the figure standing at the edge of my bed, I knew something was terribly wrong. I wasn't dreaming. What had begun as a peaceful night in my new apartment was about to become an experience that would change my life forever. I had moved into this place just a few weeks ago. It was small but cozy, perfect for someone living alone. There was something charming about the old building with its narrow hallways and its creaky elevator. Yet, sometimes, the strange noises at night would send chills down my spine, but I told myself that it was just normal in an old building. That night, I had gone to bed early, exhausted after a long day at work. I fell asleep quickly. But something woke me in the middle of the night. At first, I didn't understand what had pulled me out of my dreamlike state. It was dark, and the only light came from the faint glow of streetlights filtering through the curtains. Then I saw it. A tall, thin figure, completely black, like a solid shadow, stood at the foot of my bed. I couldn't see any details. No eyes, no face, no clothing. Just a dark, motionless form that seemed to absorb the little light in the room. My body froze. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. It was as if something had stolen my voice. We stood like that for what felt like hours, though it was likely just seconds. Me, trapped in my own bed, and it, watching me in silence. Then it moved. It tilted its head slightly, as if trying to study me better. The movement was small, almost imperceptible, but enough to break the spell. My body reacted before my mind could process what was happening. I lunged for the bedside lamp and flicked the switch. The light filled the room. The figure was gone. I spent the rest of the night sitting in bed with the lights on, my heart racing at 1,000 miles per hour. I tried to convince myself that it had been a vivid dream, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. The next morning, I tried to ignore it. I told myself that I was letting my imagination get out of control. However, things quickly started to get worse. The next few nights, strange noises began. At first, it was a faint tapping on the walls, as if someone was gently knocking from the other side. Then came footsteps, seemingly moving across the ceiling, even though I lived on the top floor. One night, as I tried to sleep, I heard something even more disturbing. A whisper. It was soft, barely audible, but it clearly came from my room. "You're not alone." I jumped out of bed, turned on every light, and stayed awake until dawn. The next day, I called my landlord to ask if anyone else had reported similar issues in the building. His response sent a chill down my spine. "Ah, you live in 4B?" he asked, his voice suddenly taking on a strange tone. "Yes, why?" "Well, let's just say that apartment has a history." He explained that the previous tenant, a solitary man, had vanished without a trace. His belongings were still in the apartment when they found it empty, as if he had simply vanished overnight. I tried to brush off this information, but it was impossible to ignore. That night, when I went to bed, fear paralyzed me. But exhaustion eventually overtook me, and I fell asleep. Not for long. I woke up with an overwhelming sense that someone was in the room. I opened my eyes and saw that the figure had returned, this time closer, standing beside my bed. I wanted to move, but I couldn't. It was as though something invisible was holding me down. My body wouldn't respond. The figure leaned toward me, its face, if it even had one, close to mine. Even though I couldn't see any eyes, I felt as if it were staring into my soul. "Help me!" it whispered, its voice sounding like the crunching of dry leaves. Finally, my body reacted. I jumped up in a panic, gasping for air. The figure was gone again. The next morning, I contacted a friend, David, who believed in the paranormal. I told him everything that had been happening, and he insisted on coming over that same night. He brought with him a recorder and a device to detect changes in energy. I didn't really believe in those things, but at that point, I was desperate. David began asking questions while recording. "Is anyone here with us? Who are you? Why are you here?" At first, nothing happened. But then, the temperature in the room dropped suddenly and the recorder captured something that our ears couldn't hear at the time. When we played back the recording, a clear response was heard after the last question, "This is my home." That was the last night I spent in that apartment. I packed up, left everything behind, and left the next day. I didn't want to know more. Later, I found out that other tenants in apartment 4B had also reported strange phenomena. No one stayed there for long. The apartment is now vacant, though sometimes when I pass by the building, I think I see something dark moving behind the windows. I don't know what that figure was, nor what it truly wanted, but I learned one thing: if you ever feel like something is watching you in the dark, don't ignore it. Because sometimes, what we think are shadows might be far more alive than we ever imagined. The moment my clock stopped at 3:33 in the morning, I knew something was wrong. In the stillness of the night, The world seemed to freeze, and what followed made me question reality itself. It was a night like any other. I had stayed up late working on a project, surrounded by papers and with a cold cup of coffee within reach. Eventually, I decided to go to bed, leaving the mess for the morning. I fell asleep almost immediately. Hours later, I woke with a strange sense of unease. I glanced at the digital clock on my nightstand, and it read exactly 3:33 a.m. The second hand had stopped, and the numbers stayed frozen as if time itself had come to a halt. I thought it was a malfunction. I got up and tried to reset the clock, but it didn't respond. Then I noticed something more unsettling. The rest of the house was completely silent. There was always some noise at night, the hum of the refrigerator, the occasional creak of the pipes, the distant sound of traffic. But this time, there was nothing. It was absolute silence, so heavy that it seemed to fill the room. I got out of bed, my body wrapped in an unexplainable sense of alertness. I walked into the living room, where the wall clock had also stopped. The second hand was frozen, stuck between two marks. Then I heard it. A soft tapping, like someone was knocking on the window. My skin tingled. The living room window looked out onto the backyard garden, surrounded by a tall fence. No one could reach it without effort. I cautiously approached, my heart pounding in my chest. The curtains were drawn, but I could see a shadow moving on the other side of the glass. It wasn't a human figure, at least not entirely. The shadow was tall and thin, with a shape that twisted as if it couldn't stay in one place. The thing tapped on the window again, 3 times in a deliberate rhythm. I breathed in and slightly parted the curtain just enough to take a peek. There was nothing there. I stepped back, trying to rationalize what I had seen. Maybe I was dreaming, or perhaps it was just an illusion caused by exhaustion. But then the tapping began again, this time from the kitchen window. I slowly walked towards it, armed only with my phone, which was now completely black. The kitchen light flickered and went out just as I neared the window. I could barely make out the shadow now much closer, its amorphous form pressed against the glass. Suddenly it leaned forward, and a pair of eyes, glowing like tiny embers, opened in the dark. "Let me in," said a low, guttural voice that seemed to resonate inside my head. I ran back to my room and locked the door. My mind was filled with panic as I tried to figure out what to do. I could hear soft footsteps, as if something was walking through the house. Then the voice spoke again, but this time from the other side of the door. "Time is broken. Let me fix it." I looked at the clock next to my bed. It was still frozen at 3:33, the same time, as if time had gotten trapped in an endless loop. "Go away," I whispered, unsure if the thing could hear me. The voice responded with a soft laugh, a sound that chilled me to the bone. Minutes passed, maybe hours. Finally, the footsteps stopped, and the silence returned. But the clock remained stopped, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still not safe. When I finally gathered the courage to leave the room, the house was empty. The lights flickered weakly, and the air was thick with a strange smell, like burnt metal. But the worst part was the wall clock in the living room. Although its hands were still frozen, someone or something had written on the glass of the clock, in trembling fingers, "I will return at 3:33. It has been weeks since that night, and I still haven't been able to shake the fear that haunts me. Every single night, I wake up exactly at 3:33 a.m. My clock still works, but it always shows that time right before I wake up, like someone or something wants to remind me that it's still out there. I don't know what it wants, or why it chose me, but I know it hasn't left. Sometimes, in the silence of the night, I hear tapping on the windows. Always 3 taps. Always in the same rhythm. If your clock ever stops at exactly 3:33 a.m., don't ignore it. Don't get up, and above all, don't look out the windows. Because whatever's out there, it's waiting for the moment you do. It all began when the swing started to move. That's when I knew something wasn't right in the park. It was a calm night, and I had gone there seeking peace. But what I found was far darker than I had expected. I've always loved taking walks at night. There's something about the calm of the sleeping world that helps me think. The park near my house was one of my favorite spots, with its tree-lined paths and a small playground. Often, I'd sit on a bench by the swings, simply enjoying the fresh air. That night didn't seem any different. The stars were shining brightly in the sky, and a soft breeze whispered through the trees. But as soon as I reached the playground, an odd feeling washed over me. The park was completely empty, just as it always was at this hour. But there was something in the air, something that told me I wasn't alone. I sat on my usual bench, pulled out my phone to read, and soaked in the silence. Then I saw it. One of the swings had started moving slowly. I thought it was just the wind, but the breeze was barely stirring the leaves. The swing wasn't swaying erratically, like when the wind pushes it. It moved back and forth with a deliberate rhythm, almost as if an invisible person was using it. I stared at it, trying to come up with a logical explanation. Maybe the swing was unbalanced, or the chains were worn out. I stepped closer to inspect it, but as soon as I took a few steps forward, it stopped abruptly. The air around the park seemed to grow colder. I looked around, searching for someone, but there was no one. At least, no one I could see. That's when I heard it, the laughter. It was soft, childlike, and distant, as though it was coming from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. My skin crawled. Laughter like that didn't belong in the quiet of the night. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The laughter stopped suddenly, and the swing began moving again. This time, faster. I stepped back, my instincts screaming at me to run, but something kept me rooted to the spot. It was like I had to understand what was happening. Then I saw it. At first, I thought it was a child standing at the far end of the playground. But when my eyes focused, I realized it wasn't a child. The figure was small and thin, but its silhouette looked wrong. Its arms were far too long for its body, and its head was tilted at an odd angle. I couldn't make out its face. It was too dark. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The figure didn't respond, but it began moving toward me. It didn't walk. It seemed to glide, like its feet weren't even touching the ground. Panic surged through me. I turned and ran, the sound of my breathing drowning out all other noises. I didn't dare look back. When I reached the park's entrance, I stopped to catch my breath, checking to see if it had followed me. The park was silent, the swings still, under the soft light of the moon. I thought I was safe until I got home. I opened the door to my apartment, switched on the lights, and locked the door behind me, still shaking. I told myself it had all been my imagination, a misunderstanding fueled by the darkness and exhaustion. Then I heard a soft knock. It came from my window. My apartment was on the 3rd floor. No one could be outside my window. But the knocking repeated, this time louder. I stepped forward slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. As I pulled back the curtain, there was no one there. But on the glass, written with thin, trembling fingers, were the words, "Do you want to play?" I didn't sleep that night. Since then, I've stopped going to the park, but the feeling of being watched has never left me. Sometimes, in the stillness of the night, I hear the sound of a swing moving, as if someone is playing alone in the darkness. If you ever find yourself in a park at night, be careful. And you feel like you're not alone, trust your instincts, because some things lurk in the most innocent places, and sometimes they just want to play with you. The moment the bathroom mirror fogged up with words, I knew something in my apartment wasn't right. There was no one else in the house, yet the message, written in crooked letters, told me otherwise. It had been a night like any other. I had returned home after a long, exhausting day at work, looking forward to a hot shower to unwind. The steam quickly filled the small bathroom, covering the mirror with a thick, opaque layer. When I stepped out of the shower, wrapped in a towel, I saw it, on the fogged-up glass. Words, as though a finger had traced them there. You're not alone. I froze. Water still dripping from my hair, my mind raced. It couldn't have been a joke. I lived alone, and no one had been in here. I tried to wipe the message away with my hand, but even after cleaning the mirror, the words remained, etched into the glass, as if they were burned there. My heart pounded in my chest as I nervously checked every corner of the apartment. Under the bed, behind the curtains, and even inside the closets, nothing. Finally, convinced I was imagining things, I returned to the bathroom, but this time, the words had changed. I see you. The feeling of being watched was unbearable. I spun around, expecting someone to be standing behind me, but the bathroom was empty. The apartment was silent, save for my ragged breathing. I tried to calm myself, telling myself that maybe there was something wrong with the mirror, that maybe it was an old prank someone had played before I moved in. That was the only logical explanation, right? So, I decided to leave the bathroom, close the door, and forget what I had seen. But things only got worse. That night, I woke up at 3 a.m., the overwhelming sensation that something was in the room with me. Everything was dark except for the dim light filtering in from the street lamp outside. As my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I saw something that made my breath catch. In the corner of my room, where my full-length mirror stood, a dark figure was reflected in the glass. It was tall, with elongated limbs and a hunched posture, as if it could not stand upright. I stood frozen, too terrified to move, but the worst part was realizing that the figure wasn't actually in the room with me. It was only in the reflection. Summoning all my courage, I slowly got out of bed and turned on the light. The reflection disappeared, and the mirror showed only my empty room. I turned off the light and climbed back into bed, trying to convince myself that it had all been a trick of the mind, a dream. But as soon as my eyes closed, I heard it. Let me in. I jumped out of bed, flicking on all the lights. I stared at the mirror. This time, no figure, but there was a new message, etched into the surface as though it had been carved from the inside of the glass. I'm always here. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Over the following days, more strange occurrences began to unfold. The mirrors in the apartment seemed to reflect things that weren't there, shadows moving, faces that weren't mine, and that constant, unnerving feeling that something was watching me from the other side. I tried to get rid of them, taking all the mirrors and throwing them into the trash. But the next day, they were back, exactly where they had been before. Desperate, I turned to the internet, reading about paranormal phenomena related to mirrors. Some said they were portals, windows to another world or dimension, and sometimes something could cross through. I tried to seal them with black cloth, following advice from online forums. For a few days it worked. But then one night, I found one of the mirrors uncovered, with a new message written on it. You can't hide from me. Finally, I contacted a paranormal expert. When he arrived, he inspected the apartment, his face growing more and more worried. There's something trapped here, he said. Something is using the mirrors to manifest. I asked him if there was any way to get rid of it, but he shook his head. It's not just about the mirrors. This is already connected to you. Since that conversation, my life has never been the same. I moved to a new apartment, but the mirrors still behave strangely. Sometimes, when I walk past one, I see shadows that shouldn't be there, or a reflection that takes a second too long to move. I can no longer look into a mirror without feeling like someone, or something, is staring back at me. If you ever notice something strange in a mirror, an image that doesn't match, or words that appear for no reason, don't ignore it. You might be opening a door you didn't know existed, because sometimes, mirrors don't just reflect what's in front of them. Sometimes they reflect what lurks beyond. The moment I heard the first knock from the basement, I knew something was terribly wrong. There shouldn't have been anyone down there. It was late and I lived alone, and what happened that night made me wish I had never investigated my house. It was an old house, One of those with high ceilings, creaky floors, and of course, a dark basement I rarely went down to. I only used it to store things I didn't need. Even though I had lived there for 2 years, there was always something unsettling about that place. It was well past midnight, and I was in the living room watching a movie when I heard a sharp thud echo from below. I froze, my mind racing, trying to find logical explanations. Maybe something had fallen off one of the shelves, or perhaps a gust of wind had knocked something over. But I couldn't ignore the fact that the basement had no windows or ventilation. I turned off the TV and sat in silence, hoping to hear something else. For several minutes, there was nothing. Just when I was about to convince myself that I had imagined the noise, another louder thud came, followed by what sounded like footsteps. Fear immediately gripped me, and my eyes instinctively darted toward the door that led to the basement. It was a heavy wooden door with an old doorknob, always kept shut. I slowly approached, listening to each creak of the floor beneath my feet. "Hello?" My voice barely escaped as a whisper. No response. But the footsteps continued. My throat went dry, and I leaned in closer to the door, pressing my ear against it. The footsteps were erratic, like someone pacing back and forth downstairs. I took a deep breath, my mind torn between logic and the instinct to flee. "It's just your imagination," I kept telling myself, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. Carefully, I opened the door, and a rush of cold, damp air from the basement greeted me. The stairs creaked beneath my weight as I descended, phone in hand, its light guiding the way. The basement looked the same as always, cluttered with stacked boxes and old furniture covered in sheets. But something felt different. "Is anyone here?" I asked, my voice trembling. For a moment, there was silence. Then a noise came from the farthest corner of the basement, where the light from my phone couldn't reach. It was a creak followed by heavy, labored breathing. I aimed the light toward the corner, and my heart stopped. There, in the darkness, something was there. At first, I thought it was just a shadow caused by the mess. But then it moved. It was a figure crouching, too large to be an animal, yet with a posture that didn't seem human. My phone's light flickered, and the figure slowly stood up. The last thing I saw before my phone's battery died were two glowing eyes staring back at me from the dark. I screamed and bolted up the stairs, slamming the door shut behind me. My mind went blank, my heart pounding in my ears. I barricaded myself in my room with a chair against the door and a kitchen knife in hand. I tried calling someone, but my phone wouldn't turn on. For hours, I heard creaks and thuds throughout the house, as if something was exploring it, searching for me. When I finally gathered enough courage to leave my room, the house was in perfect order. The basement door was still shut, as if nothing had happened. I tried convincing myself it had been a bad dream, but when I went down to the basement the next day, the marks were still there, deep rakes in the concrete floor, as if something with claws had been dragging itself across it. It's been weeks since that night, and I can't sleep without hearing those footsteps in my mind, that creak still echoing in my chest. I sold the house and moved out, but something followed me. Sometimes, on the quietest nights, I hear a muffled thud from the closet or a creak from under the floor. Whatever it was didn't stay in the basement. If you ever hear something in a place where nothing should be, don't investigate. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. The moment I received the text, I knew something was wrong. I didn't recognize the number, but the message was enough to freeze my blood. "Why haven't you replied? I'm right outside." It was almost 11 p.m., and I was alone at home, curled up on the couch with a blanket, watching TV. It had been a long day. I wasn't expecting visitors, let alone such a disturbing message. At first, I thought it was a mistake or a prank, but when I looked out the window toward the empty street, my heart began to race. My house is in a quiet neighborhood with homes separated by wide gardens. At night, the streetlights cast long shadows that dance with the wind. There was no one in my street, at least, not that I could see. I decided to ignore the message and continue watching my show, but not even a minute later, my phone vibrated again. "I'm watching you. Why do you keep ignoring me?" This time, the message came with a picture. It was of my house, taken from somewhere near the front garden. I quickly jumped up, turning on all the lights and making sure the doors were locked. I peered through every window, but I didn't see anything out of the ordinary. I dialed the number from which the messages had come, but it rang several times before going to voicemail. The automated voice didn't say a name, just the generic number of the line. As I tried to convince myself that this was just a cruel joke, another message came through. "That's not going to help. I'm closer than you think." My body stiffened as my eyes scanned the living room, trying to stay calm, but fear was beginning to take hold of me. I called 911, quickly explaining the situation. The operator tried to reassure me, saying that an officer would be sent out right away. When I hung up, the house was completely silent. Every creak of the walls and every gust of wind seemed amplified. I decided to wait in the hallway, away from the windows, clutching a knife in my hand. Then I heard it. The tapping. It was coming from the back door. Soft, but persistent. I didn't dare move. I froze, listening to the sound continuing. Eventually, I gathered my courage and slowly approached the door. Through the frosted glass, I saw a shadow. It was tall, thin, and completely still, except for the movement of a hand gently tapping against the door. My phone vibrated once more in my hand. "Open the door. I'll come in anyway." I took a step back, my heart hammering in my ears. I screamed that the police were on their way, hoping it would be enough to scare whoever was outside. But the shadow didn't move. Instead of leaving, the tapping stopped, and everything fell silent. I thought maybe it had gone away, but when I moved closer to the window to look into the backyard, something made me recoil with a muffled scream. There, on the window, was a word written with what appeared to be a wet finger: "Run." The lights flickered and suddenly went out, plunging the house into complete darkness. My phone was the only source of light, but its battery was nearly dead. I rushed to the front door, thinking of running into the street and waiting for the police there. But when I turned the doorknob, it wouldn't open. It was as if it were locked from the outside. My phone vibrated one last time. Too late. I felt a movement behind me, the air growing cold, as if someone was standing too close. My mind screamed at me not to turn around, but my body didn't obey. The last thing I saw before everything went black were two glowing eyes reflecting in the dark. When I woke up, I was lying in the front yard. The flashing lights of a patrol car lit up the street, and an officer was speaking to me, asking me to tell him what had happened inside the house. They found no signs of forced entry or any traces of anyone else. The only thing left behind was my phone, its messages deleted, and with the battery completely drained. Since that night, I've been plagued with recurring nightmares, always with those glowing eyes watching me from the shadows. I left that house shortly after, but the feeling of being watched has never left me. If you ever receive a strange message, especially one that seems to know more about you than it should, don't ignore it. Because you never know who is really on the other side or how close they might be. The moment I saw the name Jake Morrison on the name tag pinned to his shirt, my blood ran cold. Jake, the quiet guy from chemistry class, was now standing in front of me, his gaze burning with intensity. This wasn't the reunion I had been expecting. It was the beginning of a nightmare. 10 years. That's how long it had been since I walked the halls of Westfield High School. A decade spent building a career, making new friends, and trying to forget the awkwardness of my teenage years. When the invitation for the reunion arrived, I hesitated to attend, but curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to see how much everyone had changed, to measure my own progress against theirs. It was pure vanity. If I had known what was waiting for me, I would have burned that invitation and never looked back. The reunion was held in the school's gymnasium, transformed for the occasion with streamers, balloons, and a sad disco ball. The smell of punch and nostalgia filled the air. I arrived late, thinking I would make a grand entrance, but instead, I slipped in almost unnoticed as the conversations of hundreds of people filled the room. I recognized a few faces here and there: the football team captain, now sporting a prominent beer belly; the head cheerleader, wearing a smile that was a little too wide and desperate. Everyone was trying too hard to impress, to prove how well they'd done since high school. It was exhausting. I was about to head to the bar for a much-needed drink when I felt a tap on my shoulder. I turned, and there he was, Jake Morrison. Jake had been easy to overlook in high school, quiet, average-looking, always sitting at the back of the class. We'd worked together on a couple of chemistry projects, but I didn't remember ever having an actual conversation with him. Now, here he was, standing in front of me with a wide smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Sarah, I knew you'd be here," he said, his voice carrying a strange enthusiasm, almost forced. "Jake, hey," I responded, trying to find something to say. "It's been a long time. How have you been?" His smile widened even more. "Oh, I've been great. Really great. I've thought a lot about you." The way he said it made my skin crawl, but I brushed it off. After all, it was Jake, the quiet, seemingly harmless Jake. "That's good to hear," I said, already searching for an excuse to escape. "Well, I was about to grab a drink. It was good to see you." I turned to leave, but his hand shot out and grabbed my arm with surprising strength. "Let me get you something," he insisted. "What do you like to drink?" Before I could protest, he was already guiding me toward the bar. I could feel the eyes of former classmates on us, their faces showing curiosity and confusion. Jake Morrison and Sarah Thompson, a rather unlikely pair, no doubt. As we waited for our drinks, Jake couldn't stop talking. He knew everything about my life since high school, my job, where I lived, even the name of my cat. It was unsettling. "How do you know all this?" I asked, unable to hide the sharpness in my voice. He simply smiled, a smile that seemed to exist solely to make me uncomfortable. "I like to stay updated on old friends," he said, "especially people like you." I felt a shiver run down my spine as I took a long sip, seeking courage from the alcohol. Jake didn't take his eyes off me, studying every move I made as if analyzing an experiment. As the night went on, I tried to distance myself from Jake. When I went to the bathroom, he was gone. When I stepped outside for some fresh air, he appeared beside me moments later. "Remember that chemistry project we did together?" he asked, his voice low as the cool night air brushed against my tense skin. "Yeah," I said, though I didn't trust my own voice. Of course, I remembered it. It was the only time we'd worked together. "We learned a lot from that project," he continued, his tone almost dreamy. "About chemicals, sure. But also about you. How you would bite your lip when you were focused. The smell of your shampoo. The sound of your laugh." Alarms began ringing in my head. This wasn't just a nostalgic memory. This was something else. "Jake," I said carefully. "That was a long time ago. We were just teenagers." His expression changed. His face darkened. "It doesn't feel like it was that long ago," he said, his voice dropping to a low, chilling tone. "It feels dangerous, like yesterday. Every day feels like yesterday when I think of you, Sarah." I took a step back, but he advanced, closing the distance. "I've waited so long for this night," he whispered, "to see you again, to tell you how I feel." "I think I should leave," I said, my voice trembling. I turned to go back to the gym, but his hand closed around my wrist like a vice. "You can't leave," he said. I could see his face now, a mask of desperation and fury. "No, not yet, not when we have so much to talk about." With a desperate tug, I managed to break free from his grip and ran back to the gym. My heart was pounding in my chest as my eyes scanned the room, searching for anyone who could help me. But everyone was caught up in their conversations, laughing, reminiscing about the good old times. No one noticed my panic. Behind me, I felt his presence before I saw him. I turned, and there he was, Jake, his face now twisted in an expression of contained rage. "Why are you running from me?" he demanded, his voice heavy with bitterness. "After everything I've done for you, you ignore me. What have you done?" I asked, confused and terrified. "Jake, we barely knew each other in high school. We hadn't spoken in 10 years. He laughed, a harsh sound that made several nearby people turn and glance over in curiosity. "Oh, Sarah," he said, shaking his head. "We've talked every day. You just didn't know it was me." A chill ran down my spine as the pieces started to fall into place. The anonymous messages I'd received over the years, the feeling of being watched when I was alone, the strange gifts that appeared on my doorstep with no sender. "It was you," I whispered, feeling my stomach drop. "All this time, it was you." Jake nodded, a chilling smile spreading across his face. "I knew you'd eventually realize. I've always been here for you, Sarah. Watching over you, protecting you. And now, we can finally be together." I stepped back, crashing into a table of drinks. "You're crazy," I said, my voice breaking. "You need help." His expression hardened, anger replacing his smile. "Crazy? I'm not crazy. I love you, Sarah. I've loved you for 10 years. While you ignored me, while you dated other guys, while you lived without me. But that ends tonight." Jake took a step toward me, and I did the only thing I could think of. I ran. I pushed past people in my way, not caring about the confused looks or murmurs of protest. All that mattered was escaping. I bolted out into the parking lot, my heart hammering in my ears. I desperately fumbled for my keys in my bag, my hands trembling so much I almost dropped them. Behind me, I heard his voice calling out. "Sarah!" he shouted. "You can't run from this. We're meant to be together." I finally pulled out the keys and dove into my car, slamming the doors just as Jake reached me. He pounded on the driver's side window with force, his face twisted with frustration and desperation. "Don't do this!" he screamed, his voice echoing in the silence of the parking lot. "You know I love you!" I started the engine, and before he could do anything else, I accelerated, leaving a cloud of gravel behind me. In the rearview mirror, I saw Jake standing under the parking lot lights, his figure motionless as I drove away. I drove for hours, unable to go back home. I stopped at a gas station and called the police from my phone, my voice trembling as I told them everything that had happened. When they arrived, they took my statement and promised to investigate. But I could hear the skepticism in their voices. To them, it probably sounded like a bad reunion gone wrong. But I knew the truth. In the following days, the police found evidence of Jake's obsession, hidden cameras in my apartment, a notebook filled with detailed notes about my daily routine. He was arrested, but he managed to post bail while awaiting trial. Now I live in constant fear. I changed my phone number, deleted all my social media accounts, and am even considering moving to another city. But the paranoia remains. Every time I get a call from an unknown number, every time I see someone who looks like him on the street, the panic comes rushing back. Jake is still out there, and I don't know when he'll strike again. Although the authorities assure me that they are monitoring the situation, I know that doesn't guarantee my safety. I'm working on reclaiming my life. I'm seeing a therapist, learning to manage the trauma, but the memory of that night, his obsessive gaze, still haunts me. The girl who walked into that gym, full of curiosity, is gone. In her place is someone more cautious, more watchful. And even though I am terrified, I refuse to let Jake win. The moment I saw his eyes in the rearview mirror, I knew I had made a terrible mistake. What should have been a routine delivery turned into a nightmare, and now, I was trapped in my own car with a man who clearly had no intention of letting me go. It was my last delivery of the night. I had been working for DoorDash for months, trying to earn a little extra cash to pay off my student loans. Most nights were quiet: pick up the food, drop it off, repeat. But that night, everything was different from the start. The order came in just as I was about to log off. It was for a restaurant I'd never heard of, a small place on the outskirts of town. The delivery address was even farther away, a solitary house at the end of a winding path. I hesitated for a moment. My instincts told me something was off, but the generous tip promised was hard to ignore. I thought one more delivery wouldn't hurt. I should have listened to my gut. The restaurant was unsettling, to say the least, an old, crumbling building with flickering neon signs and windows so filthy I could barely make out the inside. The man who handed me the food barely looked at me, just shoved a greasy bag into my hands and muttered something that could have been, "Have a good night." As I drove toward the delivery address, the houses grew fewer and farther between. The road narrowed, winding through a dense forest. My GPS lost signal, leaving me to rely on the vague directions I had memorized. Finally, I spotted the correct number on a lonely mailbox. The driveway was long and unpaved, leading up to a dilapidated house set far from the road. There were no lights on, and for a moment, I considered leaving the food in the mailbox, but I needed that tip. So, gathering what little courage I had left, I drove to the end of the path. The house was as desolate as the restaurant, peeling paint, shutters hanging crookedly, and not a single car in sight. I sat in my car for a moment, debating whether to get out. Then I saw movement in one of the dark windows. Taking a deep breath, I grabbed the food and stepped out of the car. The sound of gravel crunching under my feet echoed in the silence, each step feeling heavier than the last. I rang the doorbell, the sound of it reverberating inside the house. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the door creaked open. The man who answered was tall and gaunt, with sunken eyes that seemed to bore right through me. He smiled, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. "Ah, my dinner has arrived," he said, his voice formal and strangely calm. "Please come in. I'll get the money." Every alarm in my head went off. Everything in me screamed not to go inside, but for reasons I still can't understand, I stepped into the house. The inside was as neglected as the outside, peeling wallpaper, a damp smell in the air, and a heaviness that made you want to turn back. The man disappeared into another room, leaving me standing awkwardly in the foyer. That's when I saw them, the photos on the wall. There were dozens of them, all arranged haphazardly. Women of various ages, captured in everyday situations. Some behind counters, others getting out of cars, some even staring directly at the camera with expressions of surprise or discomfort. There was something chillingly intimate about each photo, as if none of these women knew they were being photographed. I moved closer, my eyes frantically scanning, and then I saw it. One of the photos was of a delivery driver wearing a DoorDash jacket. My stomach dropped. Without thinking, I backed toward the door, determined to leave that house and never look back. But when I turned, the man was standing there, blocking the exit. "Leaving so soon?" he asked, his smile now completely gone. "But we haven't had dinner yet." I tried to push past him, but his arm shot out and grabbed me with surprising strength. "I can't let you go," he said in a low voice, and that's when I knew. The nightmare was only just beginning. And almost regrettably, I have been waiting for someone like you for such a long time. What happened next is a blur, a memory of fighting, screaming, the sound of something breaking. Somehow, I managed to break free and run towards my car. The seconds that followed were the longest of my life. The sound of my keys hitting the ground as I trembled, trying to pick them up. The noise of his footsteps behind me, the feeling of his hand grabbing my shoulder just as I managed to get into the car and slammed the door shut. My hands shook violently as I started the engine, barely holding it together enough to put the car in gear. He slammed his fist against my window, his face twisted with rage. But before he could do anything else, I hit the gas and sped down the driveway. I thought I was safe, but I was wrong. As I drove down the long driveway, my heart still pounding in my chest, I saw headlights in my rearview mirror. The car was gaining on me fast. He was following me. The car behind me was an old model, its engine roaring as it gained ground. The curves of the driveway left no room for error, and the darkness made each turn more dangerous. My hands gripped the wheel tighter, trying to keep control as he closed in. Suddenly, I felt the impact. His car slammed into my rear bumper, jolting my vehicle and sending my head crashing into the headrest. My car skidded out of control, but I managed to straighten it out just in time. Fear turned into pure adrenaline. I slammed on the gas, praying my old car had enough left to put some distance between us. The road twisted through dense trees, no lights or signs of life for miles. My GPS had died, leaving me alone with my instincts and the hope of finding an exit soon. Another collision shook my car, this time harder. I felt the rear wheels slide slightly toward the shoulder before I regained control. I could see him now, through my rearview mirror, his dark face illuminated by the headlights of his car. "Come on," I whispered through gritted teeth, pressing the accelerator even harder. Finally, like a miracle, I saw a flash of light in the distance. A lit sign, a gas station. It was my only chance. I swerved sharply into the parking lot, tires screeching as the car skidded to a stop in front of the store. I leaped out and rushed inside, barely managing to pull open the glass door before it closed behind me. The attendant, an older man with thick glasses, stared at me with a mix of confusion and alarm. "Please call the police," I cried, my voice trembling with panic. "There's a man after me. He's trying to kill me." The attendant didn't ask any questions. He grabbed the phone and began dialing as I crouched behind the counter, peeking through the window. I saw the man's car at the edge of the parking lot, but it didn't pull in. Instead, he slowed down and drove right past, the headlights fading into the darkness. When the police arrived, I told them everything: the house, the photos, the chase. They listened seriously, inspected my car, and took my statement. The next day, the officers located the house, but it was empty. No photos, no sign of the man, nothing. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. I quit my job as a delivery driver the next day. The extra money wasn't worth the risk. But even weeks later, the feeling of being watched didn't go away. Every time I saw an old car parked near my house, every time I received a call from an unknown number, I felt that same icy fear. The police said it was hard to track someone like that. It could have been a homeless man or someone who didn't even live in the city. But I knew he was out there. Now, I live in constant caution. I changed my daily route, installed security cameras around my house, and always carry pepper spray with me. But the worst part isn't the fear of him coming back. It's not knowing when. The moment I saw the children's eyes, I knew something was terribly wrong. What should have been an ordinary babysitting job turned into a night of unimaginable horror, and I was trapped right in the middle of it. It was supposed to be an easy job. I had been watching the Wilson children for months, Emma, 8 years old, and Tyler, 6. Every Friday night, the Wilsons would come home before midnight. The kids were usually asleep by 9, and I would take the opportunity to get some homework done while earning a little extra cash. It was a win-win. That Friday started like any other. I arrived at 6 p.m. and was greeted by Mrs. Wilson, who was rushing to put on her earrings while Mr. Wilson impatiently honked the car horn outside. "The emergency numbers are on the fridge, and the kids should be in bed by 9. No sugar after 7, Mrs. Wilson reminded me, giving the same speech I had heard a dozen times before. "Oh, and Sarah," she added in a lower voice, "the kids have been acting a bit off lately. Probably just a virus going around the school." Nothing to worry about, though. I'm sure it's nothing. With that cryptic comment, she left, leaving me alone with Emma and Tyler. At first, everything seemed normal. We had macaroni and cheese for dinner, their favorite, and I let them watch some TV while I focused on my calculus homework. But as the night wore on, I started to notice small things, strange things. Emma, who was normally talkative and full of energy, was eerily quiet. She sat on the couch, staring at the TV, but it was as if she wasn't really watching it. Tyler, on the other hand, couldn't sit still. He paced the room, occasionally pressing his ear to the wall as if he were listening for something. "Are you guys okay?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. "Are you feeling okay?" They turned to look at me, and I felt a chill run down my spine. There was something off about their eyes. Their pupils were dilated, nearly completely black, and they reflected the light in an unnatural way. "We're fine, Sarah," Emma said in a flat, emotionless voice. "Everything's fine." I laughed nervously, trying to shake the growing sense of unease. "All right, well, it's almost bedtime. Why don't you go upstairs and get ready?" They didn't move. They just kept staring at me with those unsettling eyes. "Sarah," Tyler said in an unnervingly deep voice for a 6-year-old. "Do you want to play a game?" Before I could answer, the lights flickered, once, twice, and then went out, plunging us into darkness. I heard movement in the dark, little feet sliding across the wooden floor. "Emma? Tyler?" I called, groping for my phone to use as a flashlight. "Where are you?" The light from the screen illuminated the room with an eerie, ghostly blue glow. The kids were gone. My heart raced as I hurried to the kitchen to find the fuse box. As I passed the foot of the stairs, I heard a giggle from upstairs. But it didn't sound like Emma or Tyler. It sounded wrong. I found the fuse box and flipped the switches. The lights flickered back on. I let out a sigh of relief, but that relief didn't last long. As I turned toward the living room, I saw something that froze my blood. On the wall, written with what seemed to be blood, were the words "Play with us." It had to be a joke, right? Some elaborate prank by the Wilsons. But even as I thought it, I knew deep down it wasn't true. The fear I felt was too real. I ran toward the front door, thinking only of escaping. But it wouldn't open. The knob turned, but it was as if something on the other side was holding it shut. "Emma! Tyler!" I shouted, my voice breaking with panic. "This isn't funny! Get out now!" In response, I heard that same distorted laugh, but this time it came from the kitchen. I turned quickly, and there they were, standing together in the doorway. But they didn't look like Emma and Tyler anymore. Their skin was pale, almost translucent, with dark veins visible under the surface. Their mouths were stretched into impossible grins, revealing rows of sharp teeth. And their eyes. Oh my God, their eyes were completely black, like bottomless pits. "What's wrong, Sarah?" Emma asked, her voice harsh, a parody of her usual childlike tone. "Don't you want to play?" I stepped back, my mind racing to find a rational explanation. "What are you?" I whispered, my back pressed against the closed door. Tyler tilted his head at an unnatural angle. "We're hungry, Sarah. Very hungry. And you smell delicious." They began to move toward me, their movements awkward and uncoordinated, like puppets controlled by an inexperienced puppeteer. I frantically scanned the room, looking for a weapon, anything to defend myself. My eyes landed on the umbrella stand next to the door. I grabbed an umbrella, holding it in front of me like a sword. "Stay away!" I yelled, trying to sound braver than I felt. They stopped, staring at me with those terrible black eyes. Then, in unison, they started to laugh. It was a horrible sound, like nails scraping across a chalkboard, mixed with the growl of a wild animal. I seized the momentary distraction to race toward the stairs. If I could make it to the second floor, maybe I could find a window to escape from. I bounded up the stairs 2 at a time, the children's laughter echoing behind me. I entered the master bedroom, slammed the door shut, and shoved a heavy dresser in front of it. Gasping for breath, I rushed to the window and tried to open it. It was stuck. I grabbed a lamp from the nightstand and smashed the glass, not caring about the cuts on my hand. Just as I was about to climb onto the roof, a sound froze my heart. From the other side of the bedroom door, a sweet, sing-song voice reached my ears. "Sarah. Oh, Sarah. Why are you running? The fun is just beginning." The dresser began to move, inch by inch, as if something invisible was pushing it. I knew my time was running out. I climbed out of the window onto the roof, the broken edges tearing at my clothes. I looked down. The ground seemed impossibly far away, but I had no choice. From inside the room, I heard the door creak open. I jumped. The fall seemed to last an eternity, then the impact. A sharp, explosive pain shot up my leg as I landed awkwardly. But the adrenaline kept me moving. I limped as fast as I could toward the street, not daring to look back. I reached the neighbor's house, pounding on the door with all my strength while screaming for help. The porch light came on, and I heard the sound of the deadbolt being undone. When the door opened, I risked a glance at the Wilson house. Emma and Tyler were standing by the upstairs window, their black eyes fixed on me, those awful smiles still on their faces. Then, just as the neighbor yanked me inside, they vanished. The police arrived, of course. They searched the house but found nothing out of the ordinary. No blood on the walls, no broken windows. Emma and Tyler were sound asleep in their beds, seemingly normal. The Wilsons returned home, confused and worried. No one believed me. How could they? Even to me, it sounded like madness. They chalked it up to stress, or maybe a bad reaction to some medication. They sent me home with a sprained ankle and a recommendation to see a good therapist. But I know what I saw. I know what happened that night was real. I quit my job as a babysitter after that. I couldn't bear the thought of being alone with kids again. My friends think I'm exaggerating, that I'm letting a bad experience ruin something I used to enjoy. But they didn't see what I saw. They didn't feel the terror I felt. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear that distorted laughter in my dreams. I see those black eyes staring at me from the darkness, and I wonder, what if it happens again? What if next time there's no escape? I don't have any answers. All I know is that the world is darker and more dangerous than I ever imagined. And somewhere, 2 children with black eyes and sharp teeth are waiting, hungry for their next victim. So, if you're ever babysitting and something feels off, if the children start acting strange or their eyes seem too dark, don't wait. Don't try to rationalize it. Just run. Run as fast and as far as you can, because you never know when a normal night as a babysitter could turn into a nightmare. The first time I saw my neighbor dragging a suspiciously human-shaped bag into his basement, I told myself it was just my overactive imagination. But by the 3rd time, I knew I was living next to a monster. It all began on a completely normal Tuesday night. I had just moved into my new rental house in a quiet suburban neighborhood, looking for a fresh start after a complicated breakup. The house was old and creaky, but it had character, and more importantly, it was affordable. I was unpacking boxes in the living room when I noticed it for the first time. My new neighbor was a tall, thin man with graying hair and thin-framed glasses. From my window, I watched him methodically trim his immaculate lawn. There was something strange about the way he moved, too precise, too controlled, but I shrugged it off. After all, I've always been prone to overthinking. That night, as I settled into sleep, I heard a noise, a dragging sound, followed by a heavy thud. Curious, I peered out of my bedroom window. Under the faint glow of the streetlight, I saw my neighbor struggling with what appeared to be a large, heavy bag. He was dragging it toward the door of his basement. For a moment, just a second, it seemed like the bag moved, but then it disappeared into the basement, and I convinced myself it was just a trick of the light. He was probably just throwing out some old garbage, I told myself. Nothing to worry about. The next morning, everything seemed normal. I saw my neighbor leave his house with a briefcase in hand, looking the picture of a respectable suburban professional. He even waved at me as he got into his car. I waved back, feeling a little foolish for my nighttime paranoia. But then it happened again. And again. Always late at night, always when it seemed like no one was watching. The same ritual, the dragging sound, the struggle with the bag, the disappearance into the basement. And each time, I felt more certain that what I was witnessing wasn't normal. I started paying more attention to my neighbor. His name was Harold, he told me during a brief interaction over the fence. He was polite, though somewhat reserved, and worked as an accountant in the city. He didn't seem out of the ordinary, but the more I observed, the more I noticed little details that didn't add up. His trash cans were always nearly empty on collection day, even though he lived alone. Occasionally, a strange chemical smell would emanate from his property at night. Sometimes he would stand in his backyard, staring at the horizon with an unsettling intensity. I knew I should call the police, but what would I tell them? That my seemingly normal neighbor was dragging suspicious bags into his basement? That he had a bad vibe? I had a bad feeling they'd think I was crazy, or worse, that I was just an intrusive neighbor causing trouble. So, I decided to do what I now know was a terrible mistake. I decided to investigate on my own. I started keeping a detailed log of Harold's movements. I noted the times he left for work, when he returned, and most importantly, when he made those disturbing late-night trips to the basement. I even bought binoculars to get a better look. If anyone had seen me, they would have thought I was the crazy one in the neighborhood. Over time, a pattern emerged. The trips to the basement always happened on Friday nights, usually around 2 a.m. They were always preceded by Harold coming home much later than usual, often in a car I didn't recognize. Finally, one night, I decided to get closer. Harold had gone out and I, armed with the courage that only fear and curiosity can provide, I crossed onto his property. The basement windows were at ground level, partially obscured by bushes. I pushed the branches aside, my heart pounding so loudly that I was certain someone would hear it. I pressed my face against the cold glass and peered inside. What I saw haunts me to this day. The basement was immaculately clean, almost clinical. Fluorescent lights illuminated a space that looked more like a laboratory than a suburban basement. Tables covered with equipment I couldn't identify, shelves full of jars containing mysterious substances, and in the center, a large metal table with straps. But it was the walls that truly terrified me. Photographs, dozens of them, lined the walls. Each one featured a different person, men and women of various ages. Some of the photos were crossed out with furious red marks. I stumbled backward, my mind spinning. This was evidence, solid proof that something horrible was happening in that basement. I had to do something. I ran back to my house, struggling to dial 911 with trembling fingers. But just as I was about to press call, the headlights of a car illuminated my living room. Harold was back. Panic swept over me. What if he had seen me? What if he knew I knew? I couldn't call the police now, not with him so close. He'd hear the sirens and know it was me. So, I did the only thing that came to mind. I turned on every light in the house and cranked the TV volume up to maximum. I made as much noise as possible, hoping to disrupt whatever he was planning. It worked, sort of. Harold hesitated, staring at my house with a mixture of confusion and anger. Then, instead of heading to the basement, he dragged the bag into the garage. I didn't sleep that night. When morning came, I called the police. I told them everything, the bags, the basement, the photos on the walls. I probably sounded like a crazy person, but something in my voice must have convinced them to at least investigate. Within hours, our quiet street was flooded with police cars. I watched from my window as they banged on Harold's door, dragged him out in handcuffs, and brought in dogs to search the property. Then came the discoveries: bodies buried in the backyard, evidence of horrific crimes in the basement. The number of Harold's victims grew as the investigation continued. The neighborhood was in shock. How had this happened here, in our quiet suburban town? How had no one noticed before? But I had noticed. And the guilt of not acting sooner crushed me. I could have saved someone if I'd gone to the police earlier. In the weeks that followed, the media flooded our street, hungry for details. I couldn't escape the constant reminders of what had happened right next door. I couldn't look at Harold's house without imagining the horrors that occurred within it. Finally, I couldn't stay any longer. I moved away less than a month after his arrest, but the memories followed me. Now, years later, I still watch my neighbors too closely. Every strange sound, every late-night activity, puts me on high alert. I know it's not rational, but I can't help it. Because once you've seen the darkness that can hide behind an apparently normal facade, you can never unsee it. If you ever get that persistent feeling that something isn't right, don't ignore it. Because sometimes, the monster isn't hiding under the bed or in the closet. Sometimes, it's right next door, mowing the lawn and waving at you.